There is an old story, so old that nobody agreed on it even when it was young, about a woman with snakes for hair, whose eyes could turn a living man to stone. Most people know her as a monster. Almost nobody remembers that she started out as something else entirely. Tonight, we're going all the way back, past the statues, past the shield emblems, past the movies, to find the woman underneath the myth. And I promise you, by the time we're done, you'll understand why the Greeks themselves couldn't quite decide if Medusa was a villain, a victim, or something in between that they didn't have a word for yet. Hey buddy, welcome back. If this is your first time here, just get comfortable. You don't need to do anything but listen. This channel is a quiet corner of the internet where we take history slow, the way it deserves to be taken, without the noise, without the rush, without anyone shouting at you to stay tuned. So go ahead and dim the lights if you haven't already, pull the blanket up, let your shoulders drop away from your ears. We're not in any hurry tonight. We have a long road ahead of us, all the way back to ancient Greece, and there's no reason to walk it fast. If you'd like more nights like this one, quiet stories that carry you gently toward sleep while still teaching you something true, go ahead and hit subscribe before you drift off. It costs nothing, and it helps this little fireside keep burning. Then just settle in, because tonight we're spending our time with Medusa, and her story is older, sadder, and stranger than the picture on the coffee mug. Before we go any further, I want you to imagine something. Not the moment of her death, not the hero standing over her with the shield raised. Something quieter. I want you to imagine a temple on the coast of Greece, maybe on a headland somewhere near Athens, with the sea a flat sheet of silver in the early evening light. Imagine cypress trees standing very still because there is no wind. Imagine the smell of old stone that has been warmed all day by the sun and is now just beginning to cool. Somewhere inside that temple, among the columns, there is a young woman sweeping the floor with a bundle of dried reeds, the kind of ordinary chore that gets done every single evening by someone, in every single temple, in every single town, and gets forgotten by history because nobody thinks it's worth writing down. That young woman, according to one of the oldest versions of this story, was Medusa. Not a monster, not yet. Just a girl with a job to do in a place of worship at the edge of the known world. It's strange, isn't it, how differently we remember her. Ask most people today what Medusa looked like and they'll describe snakes, stone-cold eyes, a face carved into shields and doorways to ward off evil. They'll rarely mention that in the version of the story most Greeks and Romans actually grew up hearing. She was once a mortal woman, famous across her homeland for one particular kind of beauty, and that whatever happened to her afterward happened to her, rather than because of some crime she chose to commit. Tonight we're going to walk through the whole arc of her life, from the earliest whispers of her name in Greek poetry, through the version most of us know from Ovid, all the way to Perseus and his famous shield, and then further still, into the strange afterlife her image had in Roman villas, Renaissance workshops, and modern art museums, where her face still looks out at visitors today, thousands of years after anyone believed she was real. We're going to take our time with this. There is no need to rush toward the sword and the severed head. The most interesting part of Medusa's story, honestly, might be everything that happened before that moment, and everything that happened after. So let's begin the way the ancient storytellers themselves would have begun, not with a monster, but with a family. a family older than the gods on Olympus. To understand Medusa, you first have to understand that the Greeks imagined the world in layers, like sediment at the bottom of a riverbed, with the oldest and strangest things settled at the very bottom, mostly forgotten, occasionally stirred up. The gods you probably know best, Zeus, Athena, Poseidon, Apollo, belonged to a relatively recent layer. Before them came the Titans. And before the Titans, according to the poet Hesiod, who was writing around the 7th century BCE and is our earliest real source for most of this material, came a set of primordial beings who represented the raw forces of the world itself. The sea, the earth, the sky, old age, strife, sleep, death. These weren't gods you prayed to for good harvests. They were more like the bones of the universe, quietly holding everything up. Among these ancient beings were two sea deities named Phorcys and Ceeta. Phorcys was a son of the sea and the earth, an old man of the water, wrinkled, and weathered the way fishermen imagined the ocean itself must be, deep down, beneath the waves that tourists see today. Ceeta was his sister and his wife. Because in these old genealogies marrying your sibling wasn't scandalous. It was simply how the earliest generations of divine beings were said to have propagated the world. Together, Phorcys and Ceeta had children, and what strange children they were. There were the three sisters who were born already old, sharing a single eye and a single tooth between them, passing the eye from hand to hand whenever one of them needed to see. There were sea serpents and other creatures whose names have mostly slipped out of memory. And there were the Gorgons. I want you to imagine this family for a moment, tucked away at the edge of the world, in a place the Greeks imagined as almost beyond geography itself, somewhere past the sunset, near where night and day were thought to change shifts. Hesiod places the Gorgons near the Garden of the Hesperides, another mythical location near the western edge of the world, close to the ocean stream that the Greeks believed circled the entire earth like a river with no beginning and no end. This wasn't a neighborhood you could visit. It was a kind of mythic frontier, the geographical equivalent of the edge of a map where the old cartographers used to write that there be dragons. There were 3 Gorgon sisters. Their names were Athena, Uriel, and Medusa. Athena's name means something like forceful or mighty. Uriel's name suggests a kind of far-roaming or wide-leaping strength. And Medusa's name, this is worth sitting with for a moment, comes from a Greek word meaning guardian or protectress, related to the verb to guard or to rule over. Her very name meant something like the one who watches or the one who protects. It's a strange name for a figure who would later become one of the most feared monsters in the ancient world, and it hints at something important that we'll come back to later tonight. Long before she was feared, her name suggested someone who kept watch, a guardian, not so different in its root meaning from the job of standing quietly in a temple doorway. Here is something that surprises a lot of people the first time they hear it. Athena and Uriel were immortal. They always had been, monstrous from the very beginning, born that way, existing outside the ordinary rules of mortality that governed human lives. Medusa alone of the 3 sisters was mortal. She could die. And this single detail, tucked into the old genealogies almost as an afterthought, is the entire reason her story is possible. If all 3 sisters had been equally undying, there would have been no way for a hero to ever defeat one of them, and the story we're telling tonight simply wouldn't exist. It's a small detail, easy to skim past, but it's the hinge the whole myth turns on. Now, if you're picturing the sisters at this early stage as women with snakes for hair and turned to stone eyes, I want you to pause on that image, because it isn't quite settled yet, not in the oldest sources. Hesiod doesn't spend much time describing what the Gorgons actually looked like. He's more interested in bloodlines and names than physical description, which was fairly typical of his style. It's only in later writers, and especially in the visual arts, vase painters and sculptors working in the archaic period of Greek history, roughly the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, that we start to get a clearer picture. And that picture, in its earliest form, is honestly a little bit comical to modern eyes. The earliest Gorgon images show a wide, grinning face with a lolling tongue sticking out, tusks like a boar, a beard in some versions even though the figure is female, and a general expression that looks less like elegant horror and more like a grotesque mask meant to startle rather than seduce. This is an important point, and I want you to really imagine it for a moment. Picture a vase painter in a workshop in Corinth or Athens, sometime around 600 BCE, dipping his brush into black glaze, painting a face onto a piece of pottery meant for a household or a temple. The face he paints has bulging eyes, a wide flat nose, and a tongue hanging out between two rows of sharp teeth. This wasn't meant to be beautiful. It wasn't meant to be tragic. It was meant to be apotropaic, which is a word we'll use a few times tonight, and it simply means designed to ward off evil. The earliest Gorgon face, called a gorgonion, wasn't a portrait of a woman at all. It was closer to a mask, a symbol, a kind of visual alarm system meant to frighten away evil spirits, thieves, and bad luck from doorways, shields, and roof tiles. So here's the strange truth we're sitting with tonight. The Medusa most people picture today, a beautiful woman with living snakes coiling through her hair, sorrowful eyes, a face you might even call lovely if it weren't so dangerous. That image came later. Much later, in fact, by the standards of Greek mythology. The earliest Medusa wasn't tragic. She was terrifying in a much simpler, more direct way, closer to a warning sign than a woman. And yet, over the centuries, something remarkable happened. The story softened in some tellings and sharpened in others, humanized in one century and monstrous again in the next, until by the time the Roman poet Ovid got hold of it, centuries later, Medusa had become something the earliest vase painters would hardly recognize. A person with a past, a home, a violation done against her, and a punishment that fell on the wrong shoulders. We're going to walk through that transformation slowly tonight, chapter by chapter, the way the story itself unfolded across the centuries, so that by the end you'll understand not just what happened to Medusa, but why the story kept changing every time someone new picked it up and decided to tell it their own way. Let's step further into that ancient world now, and imagine what it might have actually felt like to live near the edge of the map, in the strange borderland where the Gorgons were said to make their home. Life at the edge of the map. Let's go inside that world for a moment, the world the Greeks imagined when they thought about the far edges of the earth. I want you to imagine this for a moment. You are a sailor, centuries before Christ, rowing a wooden ship along a coastline that grows stranger the further west you travel. The sun is setting somewhere ahead of you, which the Greeks found unsettling in itself, because west was the direction of endings, the direction the sun disappeared every evening as if swallowed by the sea. Salt has dried on your forearms in a thin white crust. Your hands ache from the oar, calloused in a way that never quite heals, and the only sounds are the creak of the hull, the slap of water against wood, and the low murmur of the other rowers, too tired to talk much, saving their breath for the work. Ancient Greek sailors didn't have maps the way we understand them today. They had a mixture of coastal landmarks passed down through oral tradition, star positions memorized since childhood, and a healthy respect for the fact that the world simply ran out somewhere, and nobody was entirely sure where. Herodotus, writing centuries after Hesiod, still struggled to describe the far edges of Europe and Africa with any confidence, and he was one of the most well-traveled writers of his era. For the average person living in a farming village in the Peloponnese, someone who might never travel more than a day's walk from home in their entire life, the edges of the world were not really geography at all. They were closer to what we might call myth space, a place where the ordinary rules bent and strange things were allowed to exist, precisely because nobody could travel there to check. This is where the Greeks placed the Gorgons. Not in a specific country you could find on a map, but in that hazy region beyond the Garden of the Hesperides, near the river ocean that was believed to encircle the world. It's worth pausing on how psychologically important that placement was. The Gorgons weren't dangerous because they lived nearby and might show up at your door. They were dangerous because they represented what existed at the boundary of the known world, the place where civilization ended and something older and less comprehensible began. In a sense, the geography of the myth was doing emotional work. It told listeners that some dangers cannot simply be avoided by staying close to home, because they exist at the very edge of what a human mind can safely think about. Now, let's bring this down to something more human and more immediate. Imagine a household in a Greek village around the 7th century BCE, an ordinary family preparing for evening. The house is small, made of mud brick with a thatched or tiled roof depending on the wealth of the family, and the main room smells of wood smoke and olive oil, because oil lamps were the primary source of light after dark, and they had a distinct smoky, slightly bitter scent that would have been as familiar to ancient people as the smell of coffee is to us today. A mother is grinding grain between two stones for the next day's bread, a task that took real physical effort and often left women's wrists and shoulders permanently strong from years of repetition. Children sit near the hearth, half listening, half falling asleep, while an older relative tells a story to pass the evening. And what story might that older relative tell? Very possibly something like the tale of the Gorgons. Not as history exactly, but as the kind of cautionary, wondering tale that helped explain the frightening edges of a world people couldn't fully map or control. Why did some cliffs along the coast look like they'd been shattered by a great force? Perhaps a hero once battled a monster there. Why did certain shield emblems and temple carvings show that horrifying, tongue-lolling face? Because evil needed to be frightened away from sacred and vulnerable places, and nothing frightened evil quite like a face more terrible than evil itself. It's worth remembering that in the ancient world, storytelling wasn't entertainment in the modern sense of something separate from daily life. It was how information traveled. It was how children learned geography, morality, and history all at once, wrapped together in a single narrative that was easier to remember than a list of facts. When a grandmother told her grandchildren about Medusa and her sisters, she wasn't just describing monsters. She was passing down a map of the world's dangers, both physical and moral, dressed up in a story vivid enough that a child would actually remember it decades later, and tell it to their own children by the same flickering lamp light. I think it's worth pausing here to notice something. We live in a world today with satellites mapping every square foot of ocean, with GPS in our pockets, with almost nowhere left that could be called truly unknown. It's strange to imagine a time when the edge of the world wasn't a metaphor. It was a real place that sailors genuinely feared approaching, where the wind might carry you somewhere you could never sail back from. The Gorgons lived there, in that genuine uncertainty, and I think that's part of why their story has lasted so long. They represent something we've mostly lost the ability to feel quite as intensely, the fear of what lies past the edge of what you know. Let's come back now to Medusa herself, and to the story that would eventually separate her from her two immortal sisters. Because while Athena and Uriel remained, for most of Greek and Roman literature, fairly static figures, mostly mentioned and rarely explored, Medusa's story kept growing, kept changing, kept picking up new details every time a new poet decided her fate deserved a closer look. The girl in the temple of Athena. Now we arrive at the version of the story that most people find the most affecting, even though it was written down centuries after Hesiod, by a Roman poet living in a completely different world, under a completely different empire. His name was Ovid, and he was writing around the very beginning of the 1st century of the modern era, in Rome under the Emperor Augustus, at a time when Greek mythology had already been circulating for hundreds and hundreds of years, passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth, poet to poet, each one adding a little, changing a little, shading the old stories with the concerns of their own age. Ovid's great work, The Metamorphoses, is a long poem made up of stories about transformation. People and gods changed into trees, rivers, animals, constellations, and stars. It's within this collection that we find the version of Medusa's story that gives her something the earlier tradition never quite gave her: a clear, sympathetic origin as a mortal woman who did not choose the fate that befell her. According to Ovid, Medusa was once renowned across her homeland for one particular kind of beauty: her hair. Not her face as a whole, not her figure, but specifically her hair, which was said to be so beautiful that suitors traveled long distances simply for the chance to see it, and to hope for a chance to court her. I want you to sit with that detail for a moment, because it's such a specific, almost domestic kind of fame. Not fame for wisdom or wealth or heroism, but fame for hair, the kind of physical detail that would have been visible to anyone who passed her in the street or saw her at a well drawing water, the kind of beauty that neighbors would have talked about, that would have made her recognizable long before she ever did anything remarkable herself. Imagine for a moment what that kind of local fame might have actually felt like. Not the fame of a queen or a goddess, but the fame of being the most talked about young woman in your town, admired by some, envied by others, watched by nearly everyone. In small ancient communities, where most people lived their entire lives within walking distance of where they were born, this sort of reputation would have followed her everywhere. To the market, to the well, to festivals and sacrifices. There would have been little privacy in it, and very little control over how her beauty was discussed, imagined, or desired by people she had never even met. Ovid tells us that Medusa served, in some capacity, in the temple of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, war strategy, and various crafts, including weaving. Athena's temples required attendants for daily upkeep, much like the image we started with tonight. Someone sweeping floors, tending lamps, arranging offerings, and maintaining the quiet order that a sacred space demanded. This was, in its own way, an honorable position. Athena was one of the most respected deities in the Greek pantheon, closely associated with the city of Athens itself, and to serve in her temple would have carried real social weight, a sign of piety and good standing within the community. And then, according to Ovid, Poseidon, god of the sea, took notice of Medusa. What follows in the text is described plainly as an assault, committed by Poseidon against Medusa, inside the temple of Athena itself. Ovid doesn't dwell on this moment with graphic detail, in keeping with the more restrained storytelling conventions of his time, but the fact of it is stated clearly enough, and it becomes the entire hinge on which the rest of Medusa's story turns. Here is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable, in a way that ancient audiences themselves seem to have recognized, because Ovid writes it almost matter-of-factly, without excusing what happens next, and generations of readers since have found themselves troubled by it in exactly the way I think Ovid may have intended. Athena, finding her temple violated, turned her anger not toward Poseidon, a fellow deity whose power she could not easily challenge, but toward Medusa herself. It was Athena who transformed Medusa's famous, beautiful hair into a writhing mass of serpents, and it was Athena who cursed her face and gaze with the power to turn any living creature that looked upon her directly into stone. I want you to imagine what that transformation might have felt like. Describe the way Ovid describes so many transformations in his poem, as something happening to the body in real time, strand by strand, as if the hair itself understood what it was becoming before Medusa did. Ovid's transformations throughout the Metamorphoses tend to focus on this exact kind of sensory, almost clinical detail, describing skin turning to bark, fingers turning to branches, voices fading into birdsong. It's not hard to imagine a similar treatment applied here. Hair darkening, thickening, beginning to move on its own, scales emerging where soft strands of hair had been just a moment before, while the woman underneath remained, for a while at least, unmistakably herself, aware of every change happening to her. This version of the story reframes everything we've talked about so far tonight. Medusa is no longer simply a monster born at the edge of the world to strange primordial parents. In Ovid's telling, she becomes something closer to a victim twice over, first of an assault she did not invite, and second of a punishment delivered by the very goddess whose temple she had faithfully served, a punishment that fell on her rather than on the god who was actually responsible. It's worth noting that ancient audiences did not necessarily read this the way a modern reader does. The internal logic of many Greek and Roman myths often treated a sacred space's desecration as an offense against the space, and the deity connected to it, almost independent of questions of individual blame in the way we would think about them today. Athena's fury, in this ancient framework, wasn't necessarily meant to be read as fair by modern standards of justice, but it also wasn't necessarily written to be read as pure cruelty either. It occupied a strange, uncomfortable middle ground, the kind ancient myths often lived in, where gods behaved according to their own divine logic of honor, territory, and power, logic that didn't always map cleanly onto human ideas of right and wrong. And yet, over the centuries since, many readers, poets, and artists have returned again and again to this particular version of the myth precisely because of that discomfort. There is something quietly devastating about a young woman punished for what was done to her, transformed into the very image of horror by the goddess she served, and then hunted for the rest of her life by heroes seeking glory for killing her. It is, in a strange way, one of the oldest and most enduring stories about how a woman's suffering can be rewritten, generation after generation, into someone else's story of triumph. We'll sit with that thought a little longer as we move forward tonight, because it shapes everything that comes next. But before we follow Perseus on his famous quest, I want us to slow down even further and imagine what Medusa's life might have actually looked like after her transformation. Not the moment of the curse itself, but the years that may have followed it, alone, changed, and waiting for a fate she could not have chosen. The years between the myths don't tell us much about what happened to Medusa in the years between her transformation and the arrival of Perseus. This is one of those enormous silences that ancient storytelling is full of, gaps that later writers and later readers have always felt tempted to fill in with their own imagination. Tonight, let's take that gap seriously and imagine it slowly, the way it might have actually unfolded, based on what we know of the geography and daily rhythms the ancient world would have assumed for a figure living at the edge of everything. The Gorgons were said to live on an island, sometimes named Sarpedon, sometimes simply described as lying somewhere near the encircling river ocean, close to other far western landmarks like the Garden of the Hesperides. Later writers, trying to fit myth onto real geography the way people always eventually do, associated the Gorgons with parts of Libya, the general term ancient Greeks used for the North African coast west of Egypt. Herodotus himself mentions a version of the Gorgon story connected to Libya, treating it almost as a piece of distant ethnographic rumor rather than pure fantasy. Whatever the exact location, the picture is consistent. Somewhere remote, somewhere rocky, somewhere within sound of the sea but far from any city, any market, any gathering of ordinary human life. Let's imagine it. A stretch of coastline where the wind never really stops, where salt spray coats every surface in a fine white residue that has to be wiped away again and again if you want anything to stay dry. Caves worn into limestone cliffs by centuries of wave action, dark and cool inside even at midday, with a particular smell that anyone who has ever explored a sea cave will recognize immediately. A mixture of wet stone, kelp, and something faintly metallic, like the smell of rain about to fall. Imagine gulls wheeling overhead, their cries sharp and constant, the only real sound besides the waves themselves. What would the days have actually been like for Medusa, living in a place like this after her transformation? We have no ancient text that answers this question directly, but we can reason our way towards something plausible, using what we know about how these myths generally worked. She would have shared her exile, if it can be called that, with her two immortal sisters, Athena and Uriel, who according to most tellings were already living at the edges of the world before Medusa's own transformation brought her to join them. There is something worth sitting with in that detail. Medusa was not entirely alone. She had family with her, sisters who, whatever their own monstrous natures, may have represented the only companionship left to her after she lost her old life, her old home, and the ordinary human community she had once belonged to. I want you to imagine an evening on that coastline, the sun setting into the sea the way it does at the western edges of the world, painting the water in long orange and violet streaks. Medusa, sitting at the mouth of a cave, her hair, now a mass of slowly shifting serpents, catching the last of the light in an odd, almost beautiful way, scales briefly gleaming gold before the light fades entirely. Does she still think of her old life, the temple she once swept, the suitors who once traveled to see her hair before it became something else entirely? The myths give us no answer, but it is hard to imagine that some memory of that old life didn't linger somewhere inside her, the way memory tends to linger in all of us, whether we want it to or not. There's a detail in the ancient sources worth dwelling on, because it complicates the simple monster narrative even further. Medusa, in several tellings, was pregnant at the time of her death, carrying the children of Poseidon within her, children who would only be born, strange as it sounds, at the moment of her decapitation, springing forth from her severed neck rather than through any ordinary birth. We'll come back to this moment in detail later tonight, when we reach the beheading itself, but I want to plant the seed of it here, because it adds another layer to the years we're imagining now. If this detail from certain ancient sources holds true within the internal logic of the myth, then Medusa lived out her exile not simply as a transformed woman cursed by a goddess, but as an expectant mother, carrying within her the unborn consequences of the very violation that had led to her transformation in the first place. It's worth pausing here and simply noticing how heavy that combination of details actually is, when you line them up next to each other rather than skimming past them, the way summaries often do. A young woman, admired for her beauty, assaulted in a place of worship, punished by the goddess she served rather than the god responsible, exiled to the edge of the world, living out years in isolation alongside her sisters, carrying unborn children conceived through violence, and waiting, whether she knew it or not, for a hero who would eventually come seeking her death as the crowning achievement of his own legend. It's not a light story. It never really was, even in antiquity, though the ancient world often told it in ways that emphasized Perseus's cleverness and courage far more than Medusa's suffering. I think this is part of why the story has kept its grip on people's imaginations for nearly 3,000 years. Every generation that has retold it has found something new to draw out of that long, uncomfortable silence between her transformation and her death, that gap where nothing is officially recorded, but where so much clearly must have happened. Let's leave Medusa on her rocky coastline for a moment now, watching the sea, and turn our attention toward the other side of this story, the side most ancient audiences would have found far more comfortable to sit with. Because while Medusa waited at the edge of the world, a boy was being born in a Greek kingdom far to the north, under circumstances just as strange as her own, and his fate would eventually carry him across the entire known world, all the way to her door. A prophecy in Argos to understand Perseus, and why he ever found himself sailing toward Medusa's island in the first place. We need to travel to the city of Argos in the northeastern Peloponnese and meet a king named Acrisius. Argos was one of the oldest and most storied cities in the Greek world, its ruling family appearing again and again in myth, tangled up with half the major legends of early Greek storytelling. Acrisius ruled there, and he had a daughter named Danae, but no son, which in the world of ancient Greek kingship was a genuine political problem, since inheritance and legitimacy ran overwhelmingly through male heirs. Wanting to know his future, as ancient kings so often did, Acrisius traveled to consult an oracle, most likely the famous oracle at Delphi, where a priestess called the Pythia delivered messages believed to come directly from the god Apollo, usually in language cryptic enough to keep scholars arguing about the exact meaning for centuries afterward. What Acrisius received was not vague at all, though. He was told, with unusual clarity for an oracle, that he would have no sons, and that his daughter Danae would one day bear a son who would grow up to kill him. I want you to imagine receiving news like that. Not gradually, not as a rumor you could dismiss, but delivered directly by the most trusted religious authority in the Greek world, the kind of institution kings genuinely organized wars and marriages and successions around. Acrisius did not take the news calmly. According to the myth, he had his daughter Danae imprisoned, sometimes described as a bronze chamber sunk partly underground, sometimes as a tower with no door, only a small opening for air and light. The exact architectural detail changes depending on which ancient source you read, but the underlying idea stays consistent across all of them. Acrisius tried to prevent the prophecy by physically removing his daughter from any possible contact with men, sealing her away where, he believed, no one could ever reach her. It's worth pausing here on something that shows up again and again throughout Greek mythology, the idea that prophecies, once spoken, cannot actually be avoided, no matter how carefully a person tries to outmaneuver them. It's almost a rule of the genre. The harder a character works to prevent a prophecy from coming true, the more precisely their own actions end up fulfilling it. Acrisius's story follows this pattern exactly, because despite the bronze chamber, despite the isolation, Zeus himself took notice of Danae, and according to the most famous version of the myth, entered her prison in the form of a shower of golden light, falling through whatever narrow opening had been left for air, and Danae became pregnant with a son. Picture that chamber for a moment, dim and close, the air probably a little stale despite whatever narrow opening allowed some circulation, the walls damp in places if it truly was partly underground the way some sources describe it. Danae, isolated from the ordinary rhythms of court life, from festivals, from the sound of other voices beyond whatever guard or attendant might have been permitted to bring her food. And then, according to the myth, this strange golden light filling the chamber, warm rather than harsh, and afterward, in the quiet that followed, the realization that she was carrying a child. When Acrisius discovered that his daughter had given birth to a son, whom she named Perseus, he was, understandably within the logic of the myth, horrified. He did not believe, or perhaps could not afford to believe, the story of the golden light, and some versions of the myth suggest he suspected his own brother, with whom he had a long-standing rivalry, of somehow being responsible instead. Whatever his reasoning, Acrisius could not bring himself to kill his own daughter and grandson outright, since doing so directly would have been an act of extreme impiety, the kind of blood guilt that even a king desperate to avoid a prophecy would have hesitated to bring upon himself. Instead, he devised a method of disposal that let him avoid, at least in his own mind, direct responsibility for their deaths. He had Danae and the infant Perseus sealed inside a wooden chest and set adrift on the open sea. I want you to imagine this moment slowly, because it's one of the most quietly harrowing images in all of Greek mythology, even though it's often rushed through in summaries. A wooden chest, built just large enough to hold a woman and an infant, sealed and pushed out from the shore into open water, with no oars, no sail, no way to steer or return. Imagine the sound of the sea slapping against the wood from outside, the darkness inside broken only by whatever thin lines of daylight found their way through the seams of the chest, the motion of the waves lifting and dropping the little vessel in a rhythm that never quite settles into anything predictable. Imagine Danae holding her infant son against her chest, trying to keep him calm, trying not to let her own fear show in her voice as she sang or murmured to him, not knowing whether they would wash ashore somewhere safe, or simply drift until the sea eventually took them both. According to the myth, they did not drift forever. The chest eventually washed ashore on the small island of Seriphos, one of the Cyclades islands scattered across the Aegean Sea. And there, according to the story, a fisherman named Dictys found them, hauled the chest in from the shallows, and took Danae and the infant Perseus into his own household, raising the boy alongside his own family in relative safety and obscurity, far from the political dangers of Argos. I think it's worth sitting for a moment with how different this story feels from the polished, heroic version of Perseus that later gets told in association with his famous quest. Before he ever picked up a sword, before he ever faced Medusa, Perseus began his life as an infant set adrift on the sea by his own grandfather, saved not by divine intervention in any dramatic sense, but by the ordinary kindness of a fisherman who happened to notice something floating in the shallows near his home. It's a very human beginning for a story that will eventually turn quite fantastical, and I think that contrast matters. Perseus's heroism, when it finally arrives, doesn't come from noble birth alone, and it doesn't come from an easy life. It comes out of exile, uncertainty, and the quiet protection of people who owed him nothing. Let's follow him now into his childhood on Seriphos, because it's there, years later, that the chain of events leading to Medusa's death would finally begin to take shape, set into motion not by fate directly, but by the ambitions of a king who wanted Perseus permanently out of the way. The king who wanted Perseus gone. Perseus grew up on Seriphos in the household of Dictys the fisherman, and by most accounts, it was a modest, ordinary sort of childhood, at least as ordinary as childhood could be for someone whose birth had already involved a king, an oracle, a shower of golden light, and a voyage across the sea in a sealed wooden chest. Seriphos itself was a small, rocky island, not particularly fertile, known in later Greek jokes and literature as something of a backwater, the kind of place people gently mocked for being unremarkable. For Danae and her son, though, unremarkable was exactly what safety looked like. Imagine Perseus as a boy on this island, learning to fish alongside Dictys, learning the rhythms of a coastal life that would have felt, in many ways, similar to the life we imagined earlier for Medusa's exile, minus the isolation and the curse. The same salt air, the same rocky shoreline, the same sound of gulls and waves. There's something worth noticing in that quiet symmetry. Two lives shaped by the sea and by exile, running in parallel for years without ever touching, until fate eventually drew them together on a single afternoon that would define both of their stories forever. The trouble began when Dictys' brother, a man named Polydex, who ruled Seriphos as its king, took notice of Danae. Polydex wanted to marry her, but Danae, according to the myths, was not interested, and Perseus, who had grown into a strong young man by this point, made it clear that he would protect his mother from any pressure the king might try to apply. This put Polydex in an awkward position. He could not simply force the issue while Perseus remained present and protective, but he also had no legitimate reason to remove Perseus by force, since doing so openly would have violated the norms of hospitality and kinship that governed Greek social life, norms the Greeks took extremely seriously, believing that even the gods watched over the treatment of guests and strangers. So Polydex devised a trick instead, and it's worth appreciating how clever, in a cruel sort of way, this trick actually was. He announced that he intended to marry a different woman entirely, a princess named Hippodamia, and declared that he would be collecting gifts from all the young men of Seriphos to present as a bridal offering, in keeping with the customary exchange of gifts that often accompanied a Greek marriage negotiation. Naturally, everyone was expected to contribute something appropriate to their means, typically horses, since horses were among the most valuable and prestigious gifts a young nobleman could offer. Perseus, however, had no horse to give and no family wealth to draw on for such a gift, since he had grown up in a fisherman's household rather than a noble one. Feeling the pressure of the moment, and perhaps stung by the implicit comparison to wealthier young men around him, Perseus made a rash promise in front of the assembled court. He declared that he would bring Polydex anything he asked for, anything at all, even if it meant traveling to the ends of the earth to get it. It was exactly the kind of overconfident, prideful boast that young men in Greek mythology so often make, the kind of statement the gods and fate always seem to be listening for, waiting to take literally. Polydex, of course, had been waiting for precisely this opening. He asked Perseus for the head of Medusa. I want you to sit with the cruelty of that request for a moment, because it's easy to skim past it when the story moves quickly toward the adventure that follows. Polydex did not actually want Medusa's head. He had no practical use for it. What he wanted was Perseus gone, permanently, sent on a mission so dangerous that no one had ever returned from a similar attempt. Every version of the myth makes clear that Medusa's reputation, by this point, was one of absolute lethality. Anyone who looked directly into her eyes turned instantly to stone. There was no known way to fight her safely, no known way to approach her without risking permanent death, frozen forever in whatever posture you happened to be standing in when her gaze finally reached you. Imagine the moment Polydectes said her name aloud in front of the assembled court. Imagine the silence that must have followed, broken perhaps by a few uncomfortable coughs, a few sideways glances between courtiers who understood immediately what Polydectes was actually doing. And imagine Perseus himself in that moment, a young man who had just made an extravagant public promise, now realizing that he had been maneuvered into agreeing to a task widely understood to be a death sentence. There would have been no honorable way to back out. In a culture built so heavily around personal honor and public reputation, retracting a promise made in front of the entire court would have meant a permanent and humiliating loss of status, arguably worse, in the value system of the time, than simply dying in the attempt. So Perseus accepted the task, and set out from Seriphos not with an army, not with a fleet of ships, but essentially alone, carrying nothing more than his own determination, and whatever ordinary equipment a young man of modest means might have owned. It's easy, looking back at this story from thousands of years of retelling, to assume Perseus knew from the start that he would succeed, that the gods were already lining up to help him. But in the moment itself, walking away from Seriphos toward a destination he likely didn't even know how to reach yet, Perseus would have had every reason to believe he was walking toward his own death. It's in this moment of genuine uncertainty that the gods finally step into the story directly, because Perseus's task was, by any human measure, impossible to complete alone. And it's here that we get one of the most quietly fascinating parts of the entire myth, the strange and specific gathering of divine help that Perseus received before he ever laid eyes on Medusa herself. Let's follow him now as he begins that gathering, moving from god to god, gift to gift, slowly assembling the tools that would eventually make his impossible task achievable. The gathering of gifts Perseus did not set out entirely alone. In the end, though he began his journey without any obvious advantages. According to the myths, the goddess Athena took a personal interest in his quest, and this detail is worth pausing on, because Athena's involvement carries an emotional weight that ancient audiences would likely have felt more sharply than we do today. This is the same goddess who, in Ovid's version of the story we discussed earlier tonight, had transformed Medusa in the first place, cursing her hair into serpents after the assault in her temple. Now, generations later within the mythic timeline, Athena appears again, this time guiding the young man who will finally end Medusa's long exile, one way or another. Athena advised Perseus on how to proceed, and in most versions of the myth, she directs him first toward a group of beings called the Gree, the three gray sisters we mentioned briefly earlier tonight, daughters of Phorcys and Sita just like Medusa herself, making them, in effect, Medusa's own aunts. The Gree were born already old, gray-haired from birth, sharing between the three of them a single eye and a single tooth, which they passed back and forth depending on who needed to see or eat at any given moment. I want you to imagine this scene carefully, because it's one of the strangest and most oddly intimate images in the entire myth. Picture three elderly women seated somewhere in a dim, rocky place, perhaps a cave near the edge of the world, passing a single eyeball between them with practiced, careful hands, the way you or I might pass a shared pair of reading glasses around a table. There is something almost domestic about the image, despite how bizarre it sounds when described plainly. The Gree had clearly developed their own rhythm for this exchange over what must have been centuries. A well-worn routine repeated so many times that it had become entirely unremarkable to them, however strange it might look to an outside observer. Perseus needed information from the Gree, specifically the location of certain nymphs who possessed magical items he would need for his quest, and knowing that the sisters would never willingly help a stranger, especially one seeking to harm their niece, he resorted to a trick. As the sisters passed their single eye from one to another, Perseus intercepted it mid-exchange, seizing it in the brief moment it hung suspended between two outstretched hands, and refused to return it until the Gree told him what he needed to know. Imagine the panic in that moment. Three ancient women suddenly plunged into total darkness, completely blind and completely vulnerable, their entire visual connection to the world held in the hand of a stranger they could no longer even see. It's a genuinely uncomfortable scene when you sit with it slowly rather than rushing past it as a clever bit of heroic trickery. The Gree had no real choice but to comply, and they directed Perseus toward a group of nymphs who possessed three crucial items: a pair of winged sandals that would allow him to fly, a special bag known as a kibices, sturdy enough to safely hold Medusa's severed head without the wearer being harmed by contact with it, and the helm of Hades, a helmet that granted its wearer complete invisibility. From the god Hermes, messenger of the gods and patron of travelers, Perseus received a curved sword, sometimes described as an adamantine blade, sharp enough and hard enough to cut through Medusa's famously tough, serpent-covered skin, something an ordinary weapon could apparently not manage. And crucially, from Athena herself, Perseus received a polished bronze shield, so highly reflective that it functioned essentially as a mirror. This detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the single cleverest element of the entire myth, the detail that actually makes the quest solvable rather than simply suicidal. Perseus could not look directly at Medusa without being turned to stone, but he could look at her reflection in the polished surface of the shield, seeing her clearly enough to navigate and strike accurately, without ever exposing himself to the direct, lethal power of her gaze. It's a solution that feels almost like something out of a puzzle or a riddle, the kind of clever workaround that ancient Greek audiences seem to particularly delight in. The idea that even an apparently unbeatable danger could be outmaneuvered by careful, indirect thinking rather than brute force alone. I think it's worth taking a moment here to imagine Perseus actually assembling this equipment, piece by piece, standing perhaps on some quiet hillside or riverbank as each item was placed into his hands. The winged sandals, light and strange, fitted on 2 feet that had never known anything but walking, The kibices, a plain woven bag that would soon carry something no ordinary container could hold. The helm of Hades, cold and unfamiliar against his skull, granting a power that must have felt almost unsettling the first time he tested it, watching his own reflection disappear from still water while his body remained solid and present to his own senses. And finally, the shield, heavy in his arm, its surface polished to a mirror shine, waiting to become the only safe window through which he would ever be permitted to look at Medusa's face. There's something quietly moving in how many different divine and semi-divine figures had to contribute something small in order to make this quest possible at all. No single god handed Perseus victory outright. Instead, victory was assembled piece by piece, borrowed from several different sources, each contributing exactly the one thing Perseus could not have provided for himself. It suggests something the ancient Greeks seemed to understand quite well, even if they rarely stated it directly in their myths, that great feats are almost never accomplished by a single person acting entirely alone, no matter how the later legends like to simplify the story down to one hero and one sword. With his equipment finally gathered, sandals on his feet, bag at his side, helm ready, shield polished and gleaming, sword sharp at his hip, Perseus was finally prepared to make the journey that would take him to the edge of the known world, to the rocky coastline we imagined earlier tonight, where Medusa had been living out her long exile alongside her two immortal sisters. Let's follow him now on that final stretch of the journey, flying low over unfamiliar seas, watching the coastline change beneath him as the ordinary world slowly gave way to the strange, myth-soaked geography at the edge of everything. The flight to the edge of the world, I want you to imagine this next part slowly, the way you might imagine a long drive at night, watching the landscape change gradually outside the window, until you almost can't say exactly when one region ended and another began. Perseus, wearing the winged sandals given to him by the nymphs, rose up from the coastline of the Greek mainland and began flying west and south, following whatever rough directions the Greeks had eventually provided, toward the distant, half-mythical region where the Gorgons were said to live. Flight, in the ancient imagination, was not something ordinary humans experienced ever under any circumstances. Birds flew. Certain gods flew or moved with a speed that amounted to something like flight. But a mortal man, however favored by the gods, rising up off solid ground and moving freely through open air, would have represented something genuinely uncanny to any ancient listener imagining this scene. Picture the sensation of it. The wind picking up around his ankles first, where the sandals' small wings began to beat on their own, faster than any bird's wing, almost too fast to see clearly. The strange lightness in his stomach as his feet left solid ground, followed by whatever mixture of exhilaration and fear a person might feel discovering, for the first time, that gravity no longer applied to them in the usual way. Below him, the landscape would have unspooled slowly, the way any long journey does when you're moving at a pace where the world has time to properly change beneath you. First, the familiar coastline of Greece, inlets and harbors he might have recognized from stories, fishing boats small as toys on the water far below. Then, open sea, blue and vast, broken occasionally by small rocky islands that a bird's eye view would have made look like scattered stones tossed carelessly across a table. The Mediterranean world was smaller, in terms of what people actually knew and could picture, than we tend to imagine today. But it was also, for the vast majority of ancient people, essentially the entire world, and Perseus, flying above it, would have been seeing more of that world at once than almost any other human being alive at the time. As he moved further west, according to the tradition that places the Gorgons near Libya, the coastline beneath him would have grown drier, the green of Mediterranean vegetation giving way gradually to something starker, sandier, more exposed. Ancient Greek writers imagined this stretch of the world as genuinely liminal, caught between the familiar Mediterranean basin they knew well and the vast unknown interior of Africa that stretched away to the south, largely unexplored by Greek travelers of this era. It would have felt, to any ancient listener following this part of the story, like watching a hero cross gradually out of the ordinary, mapped world and into something closer to myth space itself, the geography growing less certain the further Perseus traveled, until landmarks stopped corresponding to anything a listener could point to on an actual map. Some versions of the myth have Perseus stopping along the way to visit the Titan Atlas, condemned to hold up the sky on his shoulders somewhere at the western edge of the world, a punishment handed down after the war between the gods and the Titans generations earlier. We'll come back to that encounter a little later tonight, because it becomes more relevant on Perseus's return journey than on his approach, but it's worth noting here simply because it reinforces how thoroughly this entire region of the myth was treated as a kind of gallery of ancient punishments and exiles, a landscape crowded with figures who had been sentenced, transformed, or banished by more powerful beings. Atlas, holding the sky. Medusa, cursed with a lethal gaze. Both of them, in their own ways, paying a price that seems disproportionate to whatever role they actually played in provoking divine anger in the first place. Eventually, according to the myth, Perseus arrived at the shore where the Gorgons made their home, and here the storytelling slows down considerably, because this is the moment every version of the myth has been building toward. Imagine him descending from the air, the beating of the winged sandals slowing as his feet finally touched solid ground again, standing at last on the same rocky coastline we imagined earlier tonight, the place where Medusa had lived out years of exile with her sisters, waiting, whether she knew it or not, for exactly this arrival. The myths describe the approach to the Gorgon's lair as marked by an unsettling landscape feature, statues, or what appeared at first to be statues, scattered across the ground and among the rocks nearby. Men, animals, sometimes described as entire groups of travelers, caught mid-motion, mid-gesture, permanently frozen in whatever posture they happened to occupy at the exact moment Medusa's gaze had found them. Imagine walking across that ground carefully, stepping between stone figures that had once been living men, reading in their frozen expressions whatever mixture of fear, surprise, or simple curiosity had crossed their faces in the final instant before their transformation. It would have been, by any measure, one of the most unsettling scenes a hero could walk into, a landscape functioning as a kind of silent, permanent warning about exactly What awaited anyone careless enough to look Medusa directly in the eye? And it's here, standing among these frozen figures, shield raised and angled carefully so that its polished surface caught and reflected the scene ahead of him rather than facing it directly, that Perseus finally prepared himself for the encounter the entire myth had been building toward since the moment Polydex first spoke Medusa's name back in the court on Seriphos. Let's slow down even further now, because the moment we're about to describe is the one most people already think they know. But I promise you, if we take our time with it, there's more to see here than the quick version usually allows. The beheading lets go inside this moment slowly, the way the ancient poets and vase painters themselves seem to want us to. Perseus, invisible thanks to the helm of Hades resting on his head, moved carefully among the sleeping forms of the three Gorgon sisters. Most versions of the myth agree that he found them asleep, which matters quite a bit to how we understand this scene, because it removes any possibility of a fair fight in the way we might imagine a more conventional heroic duel. This was not two warriors facing each other with equal knowledge of the danger between them. This was a carefully planned, quietly executed approach against a sleeping, unsuspecting target, made possible entirely through borrowed divine tools rather than personal combat skill. I want you to imagine the scene itself with real care. The cave, or the open rocky ground, wherever exactly this moment is imagined as taking place, would have been quiet except for the sound of breathing, and perhaps the low, dry rustle of serpents shifting slightly in their sleep, coiled among strands of hair that had once, we remember, been famous for an entirely different kind of beauty. Athena and Uriel, the immortal sisters, lay nearby, indistinguishable at a glance from Medusa herself, except that Perseus, guided by Athena according to most tellings, somehow knew which of the three sleeping figures was the mortal one, the only one whose death was actually possible. Perseus did not look at Medusa directly, not even in this moment when caution might have felt almost unbearable, when every instinct probably urged him to simply glance over and confirm what he was doing with his own eyes rather than trusting a reflection. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on the polished bronze surface of his shield, angling it carefully until Medusa's sleeping form appeared clearly within it, reversed and slightly distorted the way reflections in polished metal always are, but clear enough to work with. Guiding his sword by that reflected image alone, watching his own hands move in a direction his eyes weren't actually confirming in the ordinary way Perseus struck. It's worth pausing here on just how strange and difficult this must have actually felt to accomplish, even setting aside the mythological elements entirely. Try to imagine, for a moment, performing any precise physical task, something as simple as cutting a piece of fruit, using only a mirror to guide your hand, never once glancing down at what your own fingers were actually doing. Now imagine that task is a single, decisive strike against a target that cannot be repositioned or corrected if the first attempt fails, with a penalty for error that isn't simply a cut finger but instant, permanent transformation into stone. Whatever else we might say about Perseus, the physical execution of this moment, purely as an act of coordination and nerve, deserves genuine respect, mythological embellishment aside. According to the myth, The moment the blade completed its work, something happened that even the story's own internal logic doesn't fully explain, but which every ancient source treats as simply and directly true. From Medusa's severed neck sprang two fully formed beings: Pegasus, the winged horse who would go on to have his own long and separate mythological career, and Chrysaor, a giant sometimes described as wielding a golden sword, whose own name literally means something like "he who has a golden sword." These were the children of Poseidon that Medusa had been carrying, according to the version of the myth we discussed earlier tonight, born not through ordinary birth, but through this final, violent moment of her death. I want you to sit with the strangeness of that image for a moment, because it's genuinely one of the more remarkable transformations in all of Greek mythology, and it's often mentioned only in passing in modern retellings that are more interested in getting quickly to Perseus's triumph. A winged horse and a giant, springing fully grown from a severed neck, in the same instant that a woman's long exile and long life finally came to an end. Life and death occurring in the very same motion, the very same stroke of a borrowed sword. It's the kind of image that ancient audiences, comfortable with the strange logic of myth in a way that can be harder for modern readers to access, would have accepted without necessarily needing it to make ordinary biological sense. Myths often work this way, holding multiple meanings and multiple kinds of truth simultaneously, more interested in symbolic resonance than literal consistency. Perseus, according to the myths, quickly placed Medusa's severed head into the kibices, the special bag given to him by the nymphs, sturdy enough to prevent the head's petrifying power from affecting him even through indirect contact. Some versions of the story specifically note that the head retained its lethal properties even after death, that Medusa's eyes, wherever they might still be looking, could still turn a careless observer to stone long after the rest of her body had ceased to live in any ordinary sense. This detail matters quite a bit for what happens later in the story, because Perseus would go on to use the severed head as a weapon in its own right, on more than one occasion during his journey home, a detail we'll come to shortly. With the head safely secured, the noise of the strike, or perhaps simply the disturbance in the air, finally woke Athena and Uriel, and according to the myth, the two immortal sisters rose in fury, searching for whoever had killed Medusa, ready to take immediate revenge for their sister's death. But Perseus, still wearing the helm of Hades, remained completely invisible to them, and with the winged sandals carrying him swiftly back up into the air, he escaped the Gorgon's lair before either sister ever managed to locate him. I think it's worth pausing here, before we follow Perseus onward into the rest of his journey, to simply sit with what has just happened, without immediately rushing toward the celebration that traditional heroic storytelling usually wants us to feel in this moment. A woman, once celebrated for her beauty, then punished for a violation she did not choose, exiled for years to the edge of the world, has now been killed in her sleep by a stranger she never met, wielding weapons she could never have defended against. Also that a young king on a small island could rid himself of an inconvenient rival for his mother's hand in marriage. It's a strange, uncomfortable foundation for what the ancient world nonetheless chose to treat, for the most part, as one of its great heroic triumphs. We'll carry that discomfort forward with us now, gently, without dwelling on it too heavily, as we follow Perseus on the long journey home, a journey that would include several more remarkable stops before he ever returned to Seriphos to finally settle his business with Polydectes. Atlas and the weight of the sky on his journey home. According to several ancient sources, Perseus passed through the region where the Titan Atlas stood, condemned generations earlier to bear the weight of the sky itself upon his shoulders, a punishment handed down after the war between the Olympian gods and the older generation of Titans. I want you to imagine this figure for a moment, because it's one of the more quietly haunting images in Greek mythology, easy to reference casually but genuinely strange and sorrowful when you actually picture it slowly. Atlas, in most tellings, was not simply a strong man performing a strenuous task. He was imagined as standing at the very western edge of the world, near the same mythical region where Medusa had lived, permanently fixed in place, his arms and shoulders bearing a burden that never lessened, never paused, never allowed for rest. Ancient audiences, most of whom had at least some experience with genuinely exhausting physical labor themselves, whether farming, fishing, or manual trades, would have understood something real underneath the myth's exaggeration. They knew what it felt like for the body to ache from sustained effort, knew the particular kind of desperation that sets in when a task has no visible end point. Atlas represented that feeling stretched out to an eternal cosmic scale, a punishment with no possibility of relief, ever for any reason. According to the version of the myth recorded by later writers, Perseus, weary from his own journey and perhaps seeking rest or hospitality, approached Atlas and asked for shelter. Atlas, fearing a prophecy that a son of Zeus would one day steal the golden apples from his garden, refused Perseus's request and attempted to drive him away by force. What happened next depends somewhat on which version of the story you're reading, but the most commonly repeated account has Perseus, perhaps out of frustration, perhaps out of simple self-defense, revealing Medusa's severed head to the Titan, turning him instantly to stone. And here the myth does something rather beautiful, in its own strange way, blending genuine geography with imaginative storytelling. The Atlas Mountains, a real mountain range stretching across northwestern Africa, were understood by many ancient writers as the literal transformed body of the Titan himself. His shoulders become peaks, his form becomes stone, permanently fixed in the landscape, still holding up the sky in a sense, since the mountains themselves seemed, from certain angles and certain kinds of imagination, to touch the heavens. I think it's worth pausing here to notice how differently this particular petrification reads compared to the frozen travelers we imagined scattered across the ground near Medusa's lair earlier tonight. Those figures represented tragedy, accident, and horror, ordinary people caught by a curse they had no way of anticipating or avoiding. Atlas's transformation, by contrast, is framed by most ancient tellings as almost merciful, a release from an eternal, exhausting punishment, trading one kind of permanent fixture for another that no longer required active suffering. It's a small detail, easy to overlook, but it says something quietly important about how the ancient Greeks thought about mortality, punishment, and rest. Sometimes, in their imagination, becoming stone wasn't only a horror. Sometimes it was simply an ending, and an ending, even a strange one, could be its own kind of relief. We'll leave Atlas here now, fixed permanently into the landscape of northwestern Africa, and follow Perseus onward, because his journey home was not yet finished, and the next stop would bring him face to face with a very different kind of danger, one that had nothing to do with monsters born at the edge of the world, and everything to do with the ordinary cruelty that royal families were capable of inflicting on their own daughters. The chained woman on the cliff continuing his flight home along the coastline, Perseus eventually came upon a scene that would change the course of his journey once again. According to the myth, he spotted a young woman chained to a rock at the edge of the sea, and this woman was Andromeda, daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia, rulers of a kingdom traditionally associated with Ethiopia in most ancient sources, though the exact geography, like so much else in this myth, shifts depending on which ancient writer you consult. The reason for Andromeda's chains traces back to her mother, Cassiopeia, who had made the mistake of boasting that her own beauty, or in some versions her daughter's beauty, surpassed that of the Nereids, the sea nymphs who attended Poseidon. This kind of boast, comparing a mortal favorably against divine beings, was almost always dangerous territory in Greek mythology, a pattern that shows up again and again across dozens of different stories, and it rarely ended well for the mortal family involved. The offended Nereids appealed to Poseidon, who sent a sea monster to ravage the kingdom's coastline in punishment. Desperate, King Cepheus consulted an oracle and was told that the only way to end the monster's assault was to sacrifice his own daughter, chaining her to a rock by the sea as an offering. I want you to imagine this scene the way ancient audiences would have pictured it, and the way countless vase painters and later Renaissance artists chose to depict it as well. A young woman, chained at the wrists, standing or perhaps slumped against dark, sea-worn rock, waves breaking somewhere nearby. The constant low roar of the ocean the only sound accompanying whatever fear and despair she must have felt, waiting for a monster she knew was coming, with no ability to run, no ability to defend herself, entirely dependent on forces completely outside her control. Perseus, flying overhead and catching sight of her, according to the myth, was immediately struck by her beauty, but more importantly, was struck by the clear injustice of her situation. A young woman punished for her mother's arrogant boasting, sacrificed to appease gods whose anger she had done nothing personally to provoke. There's a quiet, interesting echo here, worth noticing gently rather than dwelling on too heavily, between Andromeda's situation and the situation we discussed earlier regarding Medusa herself, another young woman who suffered consequences for something entirely outside her own control. The myth doesn't draw this parallel explicitly. Ancient storytellers rarely spelled out thematic connections the way modern commentary tends to, but it's difficult not to notice it once you've spent enough time sitting with both stories side by side, the way we have tonight. According to the myth, Perseus negotiated with King Cepheus, offering to kill the approaching sea monster in exchange for Andromeda's hand in marriage. When the monster finally arrived, described in various sources as a massive sea serpent or a more generalized monstrous creature, Perseus fought and killed it, using either his sword directly or, in some versions of the story, the severed head of Medusa itself, turning the monster to stone before it ever reached the shore where Andromeda remained chained. I think it's worth taking a moment here to imagine the specific strangeness of that second possibility, if it's the version we choose to picture. Perseus, having just killed Medusa in her sleep at the edge of the world, now carries her severed head across the sea and uses it a second time, this time to save rather than to attack, turning a monster to stone in order to rescue a chained woman rather than to claim a trophy for a jealous king. It's a small but meaningful shift in how the myth allows Medusa's power, and by extension Medusa herself, to be used. What began as a curse, weaponized by Perseus for the sake of political convenience on Seriphos, becomes, in this later episode, an instrument of rescue, protecting an innocent woman from a fate she never chose either. With the monster defeated, Perseus married Andromeda, and according to most versions of the myth, they went on to have a long life together, eventually returning to Greece and founding a lineage that later Greek nobility, including, according to some genealogies, the family of Heracles himself, claimed descent from. It's one of the rare genuinely happy turns in this entire cluster of stories, worth sitting with gently for a moment before we return to the more difficult business, still waiting for Perseus back on Seriphos. Let's follow him there now, back across the sea toward the small island where his mother still waited, and toward the reckoning that still remained with the king who had sent him on this impossible journey in the first place. The return to Seriphos when Perseus finally arrived back at Seriphos, the small, rocky island where his entire story had begun. He found the situation there had not improved in his absence. According to the myth, Polydex had continued pressuring Danae to marry him, and had grown increasingly confident that Perseus would never return at all, having assumed, quite reasonably given the near impossibility of the task, that the young man had died somewhere on his impossible quest to retrieve Medusa's head. I want you to imagine Danae during these months of waiting, because her experience, though rarely given much space in the traditional telling, deserves a moment of our attention tonight. A mother whose son has sailed off toward what everyone, including perhaps Danae herself, assumed was certain death, forced in the meantime to continue fending off the unwanted attentions of a king who held real power over her daily life and safety, with no way of knowing whether her son was alive or dead, whether he would ever return, whether she would spend the rest of her life trapped in an arrangement she had never wanted. It's a long, quiet kind of suffering, the sort that doesn't get its own dramatic scene in most retellings, but which surely occupied a great deal of real emotional space during the months Perseus was away. According to the myth, Danae and Dictys, the fishermen who had originally rescued them from the sea, had taken refuge at a temple or sacred altar to escape Polydex's continued advances, seeking the kind of protection that sacred spaces were traditionally understood to offer in the ancient world, a form of asylum that even a king would have hesitated to violate outright. It was in this state of ongoing tension that Perseus finally returned, walking back into the royal court at Seriphos, carrying the very thing Polydex had never actually expected him to obtain. The confrontation that follows is often told quickly in summary versions of the myth, but it's worth slowing down here, because it represents the final and perhaps most morally uncomfortable use of Medusa's severed head in the entire story. According to the myth, Perseus entered the court where Polydex and his assembled companions were gathered, and rather than simply handing over the head as originally promised, he held it aloft and let its power do what it had always done, turning Polydex and his court, in most versions of the story, instantly to stone. I want you to sit with this scene for a moment rather than rushing past it toward the story's eventual resolution. This was not a battle. It was not even really a confrontation in the sense of an exchange of threats or violence in the ordinary way we might imagine it. It was, in its final form, an execution, carried out instantly and without any possibility of resistance, using a weapon that had originated in an assault committed against an innocent woman, refined through a goddess's punishment, and now deployed as a tool of political revenge against a king who had, admittedly, engineered the entire quest through manipulation and cruelty in the first place. There's something worth noticing in how thoroughly Medusa's power outlives her own personal story by this point in the myth. She is dead, has been dead since that quiet, sleeping moment on the rocky coastline we described earlier tonight, and yet her severed head continues to act in the world, turning a titan to stone, defeating a sea monster to save an innocent woman, and now settling a political rivalry on a small island she likely never even knew existed. In a strange way, Medusa becomes more powerful and more consequential after her death than she ever was during her long years of quiet exile, her image and her curse doing work in the world that she herself never chose or consented to, wielded entirely according to the needs and ambitions of the people who now controlled her severed remains. With Polydex dealt with, Perseus placed Dictys, the kind fisherman who had raised him, on the throne of Seriphos in Polydex's place, a fitting reward for the man who had shown Danae and her infant son genuine kindness at a moment when they had absolutely nothing to offer in return. Perseus then returned the borrowed items, the winged sandals, the kibices, and the helm of Hades, to Hermes, who saw that they were returned to the nymphs who had originally provided them. And Medusa's head, the final and most significant object remaining from the entire quest, was given to Athena. According to the most widely repeated tradition, Athena placed Medusa's head at the center of her own shield, or in some versions embedded it directly into her armored breastplate, known as the Aegis, where the image of Medusa's face would remain forever afterward, a permanent fixture of the goddess's own battle equipment. I want you to sit with the strange symmetry of this ending for a moment, because it brings the entire story full circle in a way that feels almost too neat to be accidental. It was Athena, according to Ovid's version of events, who first transformed Medusa in her temple, cursing her out of anger over a violation she had no power to prevent. And it is Athena, at the very end of the myth, who receives Medusa's severed head as a permanent trophy, wearing the image of the woman she once cursed as a badge of divine power and protection for the rest of eternity. We'll come back to this final image in more detail shortly, because it becomes the seed for something much larger than the myth itself, a symbol that would travel far beyond the borders of any single story, appearing on shields, temples, coins, and doorways across the ancient Mediterranean world for centuries afterward. But before we get there, I want us to pause and simply consider Perseus's own fate and the strange final turn his story took, one that brings us back, in an unexpected way, to the very prophecy that started this entire chain of events so many years earlier. The prophecy fulfilled, you'll remember the oracle that started this entire story. The prophecy given to King Acrisius of Argos, warning him that his daughter's son would one day grow up to kill him. Acrisius had gone to extraordinary lengths to prevent this outcome, imprisoning his daughter, and later setting her and her infant son adrift on the open sea in a sealed wooden chest, hoping that nature itself would finish the job he couldn't bring himself to do directly. And yet, as is so often the case in Greek mythology, every effort to avoid the prophecy simply became another step on the path toward fulfilling it. According to the myth, years after Perseus's return from his quest against Medusa, he traveled to participate in athletic games, and during a discus-throwing event, his throw went astray, carried perhaps by a gust of wind or simple bad luck, and struck an elderly spectator among the crowd, killing him instantly. That spectator, according to the myth, was Acrisius, his own grandfather who had traveled to attend the games himself. Whether by simple coincidence or by the same inexorable pull of fate that seems to govern every prophecy in Greek mythology, drawing its two central figures back together at exactly the moment necessary to complete the pattern the oracle had predicted so many years before. I want you to imagine Perseus in this moment, a man who had faced Medusa without flinching, who had defeated a sea monster and rescued a chained princess, who had turned a corrupt king to stone in his own court, now standing in stunned silence over the body of a grandfather he likely never intended to harm, realizing that an accident, a simple miscalculation in an athletic competition, had accomplished what an oracle had predicted before he was even born. There's a particular kind of horror in this scene that's different from anything else in the myth, quieter than the violence involving Medusa, less dramatic than the confrontation with Polydex, but perhaps more genuinely tragic, because it's entirely accidental, entirely without malice, and entirely unavoidable. The way Greek tragedy so often insisted fate simply was. Perseus, grieving and likely carrying real guilt over the death, did not take up the throne of Argos afterward, feeling it inappropriate to rule a kingdom whose previous king he had personally, if accidentally, killed. Instead, according to most versions of the myth, he arranged an exchange of kingdoms with a relative, and eventually founded the city of Mycenae, which would go on to become one of the most significant and powerful cities in the Greek Bronze Age, later associated with the legendary King Agamemnon and the entire cycle of stories surrounding the Trojan War. It's a strange, quiet ending for a story that began with such dramatic violence. A young man who once faced down a monster capable of turning any living thing to stone, settling eventually into the ordinary business of founding and governing a city, living out the remainder of his life with Andromeda by his side. We'll leave Perseus here now, his part in this story largely complete, and turn our full attention back to Medusa herself, because her story, unlike his, did not end with her death. In many ways, it was only just beginning. A face on every doorway lets go inside a different kind of scene now, not a battlefield or a temple, but an ordinary ancient marketplace, somewhere in Greece or later in Rome, centuries after Perseus had lived out his life and died. Imagine walking along a row of shops and houses, the air thick with the smell of bread baking somewhere nearby, mixed with the sharper scent of fish being sold at a stall just up the street, voices calling out prices, the general noise of ordinary daily commerce. And there, above several of the doorways you pass, carved into stone lintels or painted onto wooden panels, you notice the same strange, wide-eyed, sometimes tongue-lolling face appearing again and again. This is the Gorgon, the image of Medusa's face, and by this point in history, centuries after her death within the mythic timeline, it had become one of the single most widespread protective symbols in the entire ancient Mediterranean world. I mentioned earlier tonight that the concept of an apotropaic image, something designed specifically to ward off evil, was central to how the earliest Greek artists actually depicted the Gorgons. This tradition didn't fade after the myth of Perseus became popular. If anything, it grew stronger and more widespread, because the story of Perseus provided a kind of narrative justification for exactly why Medusa's face carried such protective power. If her gaze could turn even the fiercest monster to stone, then surely her image, carved or painted onto a shield, a temple pediment, or a house's entryway, could serve as a permanent, silent guardian, frightening away any evil that might otherwise approach. Imagine, for a moment, a Greek hoplite soldier preparing for battle, strapping on his armor in the gray light before dawn, the smell of oiled leather and bronze filling the tent or barracks around him. Many Greek shields carried a Gorgon at their center, a face meant to be the very last thing an approaching enemy saw before a blow landed, a psychological weapon as much as a decorative one, intended to unsettle and frighten opposing soldiers in the same instinctive way. A snarling predator's face might trigger fear in anyone who encountered it unexpectedly. There's something worth noticing in how directly this connects back to the earliest, crudest Gorgon images we discussed at the very beginning of tonight's story. That wide, grinning, tusked face painted onto archaic pottery. Even as artistic styles evolved over the following centuries, growing more refined, more naturalistic, occasionally even beautiful in the later, more humanized depictions of Medusa's face, the underlying purpose remained essentially unchanged. This was a face meant to protect by frightening, a monster's image doing quiet, constant guard duty across the ancient world. The Gorgon appears on an enormous range of objects that survive from antiquity, and it's worth taking a slow inventory of just how widespread this single image actually became. Temple pediments, the triangular architectural spaces above a building's main entrance, often featured large sculpted Gorgon faces, staring outward toward anyone approaching the sacred space. A warning and a welcome combined into a single powerful image. The Temple of Artemis on the island of Corfu, dating to around 580 BCE, features one of the most famous surviving examples, an enormous Gorgon figure dominating the pediment, flanked by other mythological creatures, clearly meant to be one of the first things any visitor noticed upon approaching the temple. Coins minted across various Greek city-states frequently featured Gorgon imagery as well, meaning that ordinary people, going about entirely mundane daily transactions, buying grain, paying for goods at a market stall, settling debts, would have handled Medusa's face, quite literally, on a near-daily basis, passing coins from hand to hand without necessarily thinking much about the mythology behind the image any more than we today think deeply about the historical figures printed on our own currency. It had become, in a sense, part of the ordinary visual furniture of ancient life, present everywhere, noticed specifically only rarely, but doing its quiet protective work regardless. Household items carried the image too. Roof tiles, called antefixes, were often molded with Gorgon faces and placed along the edges of a building's roofline, protecting the home from evil in the same way the temple pediments protected sacred spaces. Jewelry, particularly amulets meant to be worn close to the body, frequently featured small Gorgon faces, meant to offer the wearer personal protection wherever they traveled. Imagine a Roman woman fastening a small pendant around her neck before leaving her home for the day, the tiny carved face resting against her collarbone throughout her daily activities, a silent guardian accompanying her through the market, through visits to friends, through whatever ordinary business filled her day, offering a kind of constant, quiet reassurance that evil, at least the kind that could be warded off by symbolic protection, would think twice before approaching her. I think it's worth pausing here to reflect on how strange this transformation actually is, when you consider it slowly rather than simply accepting it as an established historical fact. A woman, according to the most sympathetic version of her story, was assaulted, punished unfairly for that assault, exiled, and eventually killed in her sleep for the convenience of a scheming king. And yet the lasting cultural legacy of her image, for well over 1,000 years afterward, was overwhelmingly protective, defensive, guardian-like in nature, closer in spirit to her own name's original meaning, guardian or protectress, than to anything resembling villainy. It's almost as though the deepest cultural memory of Medusa somehow retained a trace of her original, unfallen identity, even while the explicit mythological stories told about her focused almost entirely on her transformation into a monster and her eventual death. We'll carry this thought forward gently as we move into the next chapter, because this protective symbolism didn't stay confined to ancient Greece and Rome. It traveled forward through history, resurfacing again and again in unexpected places, all the way into the modern world we live in today, where Medusa's face, remarkably, still appears on objects we encounter in our own daily lives, even if most of us rarely stop to think about where that image actually came from. Medusa in Roman homes. Let's travel forward now, past the classical Greek world, into the Roman era, when Greek mythology had been thoroughly absorbed into Roman culture, retold, reinterpreted, and woven into Roman religious and artistic life almost as if it had always belonged there. It's during this period, roughly from the 1st century BCE onward, that we find some of the most beautifully preserved and quietly moving depictions of Medusa anywhere in the ancient world, many of them in a place that might surprise you: ordinary Roman homes. I want you to imagine walking through a wealthy Roman house, perhaps in Pompeii, sometime in the 1st century of the modern era, before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE preserved the entire city, tragically but remarkably, exactly as it stood on an ordinary summer day. These houses, called domus, were often organized around a central courtyard called an atrium, open to the sky, with a shallow pool beneath the opening to collect rainwater. And it was here, in these domestic, everyday spaces, that Roman homeowners frequently chose to install mosaic floors and wall paintings featuring Medusa's face. Picture the specific sensory experience of this. Sunlight filtering down through the open roof of the atrium, catching the surface of the shallow pool below, casting shifting reflections onto the surrounding walls. The floor beneath your feet made of thousands of tiny colored tiles, called tesserae, painstakingly arranged by skilled craftsmen into detailed images, sometimes geometric patterns, sometimes elaborate mythological scenes. And there, quite often, positioned at the center of the floor or embedded into a wall niche, a Medusa mosaic or fresco, her face rendered not as a grotesque, tongue-lolling mask in the archaic style, but by this later period often as genuinely beautiful, serene, almost sorrowful, her snake hair arranged in graceful, curling patterns rather than the crude, writhing chaos of earlier depictions. This shift in artistic style matters quite a bit, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. By the Roman period, largely influenced by earlier Hellenistic Greek artistic trends from the centuries following Alexander the Great, Medusa's face had transformed dramatically from the fearsome mask of archaic Greek art into something the Romans specifically called the beautiful Medusa type, a face that could genuinely be described as lovely, with delicate features, a calm or even melancholy expression, and snakes arranged almost like an elaborate hairstyle rather than a writhing horror. This wasn't a contradiction of her protective, apotropaic function. If anything, Roman homeowners seemed to feel that a beautiful, sorrowful face carried just as much protective and captivating power as a purely frightening one, perhaps because a sorrowful beauty draws the eye and holds attention in its own quiet way, distracting evil rather than simply repelling it through raw fear. Imagine a Roman family living their daily life around this image, children playing in the atrium, perhaps occasionally pausing to look down at Medusa's calm, tiled face beneath their feet, a household guardian they had grown up seeing every single day, so familiar that its mythological weight might have faded into simple, comfortable background presence. The way a piece of art in a childhood home eventually becomes something you stop truly seeing, present and protective simply through its constant, unremarkable familiarity. Wealthy Roman households also commissioned Medusa imagery for more personal items. Signet rings, used to stamp wax seals on letters and official documents, sometimes featured a small, carefully carved Medusa face, meaning a Roman merchant or official might have pressed her image into warm wax dozens of times over the course of an ordinary working day, sealing contracts, letters, and legal documents with a symbol meant to protect the document's contents and authenticity from tampering or misfortune. Roman military equipment, following the earlier Greek tradition, continued to feature Gorgon imagery on shields, helmets, and armor, meaning Roman soldiers, marching along roads that stretched from Britain to North Africa to the Persian frontier, carried Medusa's protective image with them across almost the entire known world of their era. There's something worth pausing on here, a kind of quiet, sprawling reach that Medusa's image achieved simply through this steady, centuries-long accumulation of small, ordinary appearances. She was never worshipped as a goddess in her own right. There were no major temples dedicated specifically to her, no annual festivals held in her honor the way there were for Athena or Zeus or Demeter. And yet, through sheer repetition across thousands of small, domestic, personal objects, floors and rings and shields and roof tiles, her face became one of the most widely reproduced images in the entire ancient Mediterranean world, more common, in sheer physical volume, than the imagery of many gods who received far more formal religious devotion. I think this tells us something worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Medusa's cultural power was never really about worship or formal religious status. It was about something more intimate and more constant, a presence woven into the actual daily texture of ordinary ancient life, present in homes, on bodies, in marketplaces, on battlefields, functioning less like a distant deity and more like a familiar, ever-present household spirit, simultaneously protective and unsettling, beautiful and dangerous, tragic and powerful, all at the same time. We'll follow this image forward now, out of the ancient world entirely, across more than 1,000 years of history, into the workshops and courts of Renaissance Italy, where artists rediscovered Greek and Roman mythology with tremendous enthusiasm, and where Medusa's story found new life in some of the most famous sculptures and paintings ever created. The Renaissance rediscovery lets imagine now a very different kind of workshop. Centuries later, in Florence, Italy, sometime in the middle of the 16th century. The air here smells different from anything we've imagined so far tonight, not wood smoke and salt air, but hot metal, scorched sand, and the particular mineral sharpness of a foundry in full operation. This is the workshop of Benvenuto Cellini, a sculptor and goldsmith working under the patronage of the powerful Medici family, who ruled Florence during this period, and who had commissioned him to create a massive bronze statue for the city's most important public square. The Renaissance, that great flowering of art, science, and renewed interest in classical antiquity that swept across Italy and eventually the rest of Europe beginning in the 14th century, brought Greek and Roman mythology roaring back into cultural prominence after centuries during which such stories had largely receded into the background of European artistic and intellectual life. Wealthy patrons, eager to display both their sophistication and their connection to the prestigious classical past, commissioned artists to depict mythological scenes with a scale and technical ambition that hadn't been seen since antiquity itself. Cellini's statue, completed in 1554 and still standing today in Florence's Piazza della Signoria, depicts Perseus holding Medusa's severed head aloft, her decapitated body slumped beneath his feet. I want you to imagine seeing this statue for the first time, the way a 16th century Florentine citizen might have encountered it, walking through the piazza on an ordinary errand, perhaps heading to market, and suddenly confronted with this enormous bronze figure, taller than any living person, catching the Italian sunlight along its polished surfaces. Perseus stands in a pose of calm, almost serene triumph, entirely unlike the frantic violence of the moment it depicts, while beneath him, Medusa's body, remarkably, is not rendered as monstrous or grotesque, but as a beautifully proportioned human figure, her decapitated form somehow still graceful even in death. This artistic choice matters quite a bit, and it reflects something important about how the Renaissance imagination approached Medusa's story more broadly. Rather than emphasizing her monstrousness, many Renaissance artists chose to emphasize her tragedy, her humanity, and yes, her beauty, treating her less as a simple villain to be triumphantly defeated, and more as a genuinely sorrowful figure whose death, however necessary within the story, still carried real emotional and aesthetic weight worth honoring through careful, respectful artistic treatment. We see this same sensibility reflected even more directly in the work of Caravaggio, the revolutionary Italian painter working several decades after Cellini, in the very final years of the 16th century. Caravaggio painted Medusa's severed head on a circular shield, a piece known today simply as Medusa, and it remains one of the most striking and psychologically intense depictions of the myth ever created. Rather than showing a calm, composed face, Caravaggio's Medusa is captured in the exact instant of realization, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wide with shock and horror, snakes writhing in frantic, chaotic motion around her head, blood still visibly flowing from her severed neck. Imagine standing in front of this painting, the way visitors to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence do today, and feeling the specific, uncomfortable intimacy of it. Caravaggio doesn't let you look at Medusa's death from a safe, heroic distance, the way Cellini's serene bronze statue allows. He puts you directly into the moment of her final, terrified consciousness, close enough to see individual details of fear and pain, close enough that many viewers report an almost physical discomfort standing before it, a sense of witnessing something too intimate and too raw to be comfortable. Art historians have long noted that Caravaggio reportedly used his own face as a model for Medusa's expression, adding another layer of strange, personal identification between the artist and this ancient, suffering figure. There's a detail worth pausing on here that connects Caravaggio's painting back to something we discussed earlier tonight. The painting is done on a convex shield, a deliberate echo of the polished bronze shield Perseus used to safely view Medusa's reflection during the beheading itself. Caravaggio's patron, a cardinal with strong classical interests, apparently intended the piece as a kind of ceremonial shield in its own right, meaning the painting doesn't just depict the myth, it recreates, in a sense, the exact physical object and viewing angle that made Perseus's victory possible in the first place, inviting the viewer to occupy, quite literally, the hero's own position and perspective. Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the great Baroque sculptor working in Rome during the following century, also returned repeatedly to Medusa as a subject, creating several busts depicting her at various stages of her transformation, sometimes still recognizably beautiful with only the faintest hints of serpents beginning to emerge from her hair, other times fully transformed, her expression caught somewhere between anguish and defiance. Bernini's approach tended to emphasize the psychological and emotional complexity of the transformation itself, treating it less as a single instant and more as a gradual, agonizing process worth capturing in careful, sustained artistic attention. I think what's worth sitting with, as we consider this whole span of Renaissance and Baroque artistic attention to Medusa, is how consistently these artists chose to humanize her, to find sympathy and tragedy in her story, even while working within a broader cultural and religious context that generally still framed her death as a heroic triumph worth celebrating. It suggests that something in Medusa's story, that uncomfortable core we identified earlier tonight, a woman punished for suffering inflicted upon her, exiled and eventually killed for the convenience of others, had never entirely disappeared from cultural memory, resurfacing again and again whenever artists sat down to seriously reconsider her story rather than simply repeating its most familiar, simplified outline. We'll carry this thread forward now into the modern era, where Medusa's story has continued to evolve, taking on new meanings and new interpretations that would likely have surprised even the most sympathetic Renaissance artist. Medusa in the modern world. Let's bring this story forward now, all the way into the world most of us actually recognize, because Medusa's journey through history didn't end with Renaissance bronze and oil paint. She kept traveling forward, generation after generation, picking up new meanings the way a stone picks up moss until she arrived, remarkably intact, into our own century. You may not realize it, but if you've ever seen a Versace clothing label, a handbag, a belt buckle, a pair of sunglasses, you've seen Medusa's face today in the most literal, unaltered sense. The Italian fashion house Versace adopted the Gorgon's head as its official logo in 1978, and the founder, Gianni Versace, reportedly chose the image specifically because of its ancient association with irresistible, dangerous beauty, something that could capture attention completely and hold it, the way Versace hoped his designs themselves would capture and hold the attention of anyone who saw them. It's worth sitting with the quiet strangeness of this for a moment. A curse invented by ancient poets nearly 3,000 years ago, meant to punish a woman for a violation she never asked for, has become, through an almost unimaginably long chain of cultural transmission, a luxury fashion symbol recognized by millions of people across the entire modern world, most of whom have probably never read a single ancient source about where the image actually came from. Medusa's image continues to appear throughout contemporary popular culture as well, in films, television, video games, and popular novels, usually still cast in her more familiar role as a straightforward monster, a dangerous obstacle for a hero to overcome. But alongside this familiar version, something interesting has happened over the past several decades, particularly since the latter half of the 20th century. Writers, artists, and scholars, especially those interested in re-examining mythology through the lens of gender and power, have increasingly returned to Ovid's version of the story, the version we discussed in detail earlier tonight, and have found in it a narrative that speaks powerfully to modern conversations about victim blaming, about the way institutions and authorities sometimes punish those who suffer harm rather than those responsible for causing it. The French feminist writer Hélène Cixous, in a very different context back in 1975, famously invoked Medusa in an essay urging women to reclaim narratives that had historically been used to silence or frighten them, suggesting that Medusa, looked at directly and without fear, might not be monstrous at all, might in fact be laughing rather than snarling. A woman whose reputation for danger had been shaped far more by the fear and guilt of those who wronged her than by anything genuinely threatening in her own nature. This reinterpretation has continued to develop in the decades since, with numerous contemporary poets, novelists, and visual artists returning to Medusa's story, specifically to explore themes of trauma, blame, and the long, difficult process of reclaiming one's own narrative after suffering harm at the hands of someone more powerful. Perhaps the most striking and widely discussed contemporary artistic response came in 2020, when a bronze statue by the Argentine-Italian artist Luciano Garbati, titled Medusa with the head of Perseus, was installed across from the New York County Criminal Court in Manhattan. The statue reverses the traditional composition entirely, depicting Medusa standing triumphant, sword in hand, holding the severed head of Perseus rather than the other way around. Garbati had actually created the sculpture years earlier, in 2008, largely as a personal artistic exercise, but its public installation in 2020 took on particular resonance during a period of intense public conversation in the United States around sexual assault, institutional accountability, and whose stories are believed and whose are dismissed. The statue prompted extensive public discussion, some of it enthusiastic, some of it critical of using a beheading, however mythological, as a symbol within these serious contemporary conversations, but virtually all of it engaged directly with the same core tension we've been sitting with throughout tonight's story. The question of who really deserves to be remembered as the monster in Medusa's tale, and who deserves to be remembered as the one who was genuinely wronged. I want you to imagine for a moment the strange, layered experience of an ordinary person walking past that statue in Lower Manhattan, someone perhaps rushing to a courthouse appointment, phone in hand, coffee in the other, glancing up briefly at this bronze figure and recognizing, in some dim, half-formed way, a story that traces back nearly 3,000 years through Greek pottery and Roman mosaics and Renaissance workshops, all the way to this particular sidewalk on this particular morning. In a city that Medusa's original ancient audience could never have imagined existing. It's a genuinely remarkable kind of endurance for a story that began as a fairly minor genealogical note in an ancient Greek poem about the origins of the gods. There's something worth noting here about why this particular myth, out of the thousands that have come down to us from the ancient world, has proven so remarkably adaptable to new cultural moments and new concerns. Many Greek myths remain fixed largely in their original context, interesting historically but not necessarily speaking directly to contemporary life. Medusa's story, though, seems to carry within it a kind of structural flexibility, a set of tensions, beauty and monstrousness, victimhood and danger, punishment and injustice, that each new era has found a way to read through the lens of its own particular concerns. The ancient Greeks read her primarily through the lens of heroic adventure and apotropaic protection. The Romans read her through domestic beauty and household guardianship. The Renaissance read her through tragic humanism and psychological complexity. And our own era has increasingly read her through questions of institutional justice, victim blaming, and the reclamation of narrative control. I think it's worth sitting quietly with the possibility that none of these readings is more correct than the others, exactly. Myths, especially ones as old and as widely retold as this one, were never fixed, single-meaning stories even in antiquity. Different Greek city-states told different versions. Different poets emphasized different details. The story we've walked through together tonight, drawing from Hesiod's earliest genealogies, Ovid's later, more sympathetic account, and the long visual tradition running from archaic pottery through Renaissance bronze to contemporary public sculpture, represents not a single fixed truth but an accumulation, layer upon layer, each one added by people trying to make sense of a woman who was somehow, simultaneously, a monster, a victim, a guardian, and a symbol of irresistible, dangerous beauty. All at once for nearly 3,000 years running. Let's slow down even further now, as we near the end of tonight's story, and simply sit for a while with everything we've walked through together, before we close things out gently and let you drift off to sleep. Where did this story really come from? Before we close things out tonight, I want to take a slower, quieter turn and talk about something scholars have wondered about for a very long time, where an image this strange, this specific, and this ancient might have actually originated. Because while we've spent tonight following the mythology as the Greeks themselves told it, historians and folklorists have long noticed that the Gorgon's face bears an interesting family resemblance to protective, frightening images found in other ancient cultures around the Mediterranean and the Near East. And it's worth sitting with a few of these possibilities gently, the way you might sit with an old family photograph, noticing resemblances without ever being entirely sure exactly how everyone in the picture is actually related. One long-standing theory, popular among classical scholars for well over a century, suggests that the earliest Gorgon imagery may have developed from images the Greeks encountered in Egypt or the wider Near East, regions with which Greek traders, colonists, and travelers maintained regular contact throughout the archaic period. Egyptian art, for instance, includes the household deity Bes, a squat, grinning figure with a protruding tongue and a generally grotesque appearance, specifically invoked for household protection, particularly around childbirth and the safety of young children. Imagine an Egyptian household shrine, a small carved figure of Bes tucked into a niche near the entrance of a home, meant to frighten away evil spirits before they could ever cross the threshold. The resemblance to the earliest Greek Gorgon masks, with their similarly wide, grinning, tongue-out appearance, has struck many scholars as too close to be entirely coincidental, suggesting that Greek artists may have absorbed and adapted visual conventions from cultures they encountered through trade and travel long before Hesiod ever wrote down the Gorgon's genealogy in poetic form. Another theory, somewhat more speculative but genuinely fascinating to sit with, connects Medusa's petrifying gaze to ancient anxieties around solar eclipses. Imagine, for a moment, being a farmer in archaic Greece, working a field on an ordinary afternoon, when the sun begins, inexplicably and with no warning your culture's astronomical knowledge could yet fully explain, to darken in the middle of the day. Ancient societies across the world developed elaborate mythological explanations for eclipses, often involving some kind of monster or malevolent force temporarily obscuring or devouring the sun. Some scholars have wondered whether the image of a face so terrifying that merely looking at it could freeze a person in place might trace back, distantly, to the genuine, visceral terror ancient people felt watching the sky itself seem to go wrong in the middle of an otherwise ordinary day. A fear so significant it needed a story, and a face large enough to hold it. A third theory, and one that has gained considerable attention in more recent decades, suggests that Gorgon imagery may relate to a broader ancient tradition of powerful priestesses or shamanic religious figures associated with snake worship, a practice attested in several ancient Mediterranean cultures, including on the island of Crete, where archaeological finds include famous figurines of women holding snakes, sometimes interpreted as priestesses or goddesses connected to fertility, protection, and the underworld. Under this theory, the figure who eventually became Medusa in Greek mythology might represent a distant cultural memory, deeply transformed and reshaped over centuries of oral retelling, of once respected female religious authority, gradually recast over time as monstrous and dangerous, as Greek society's religious and social structures shifted in ways that left less room for powerful, independent female religious figures. I want to be honest with you about something here, the way any careful storyteller should be honest with an audience they respect. None of these theories can be proven with certainty. We are talking about oral traditions and visual conventions that predate reliable written records by centuries, sometimes by well over 1,000 years, and the honest scholarly position on questions like this usually involves a fair amount of careful, humble uncertainty rather than confident, definitive answers. What we can say clearly is that the Gorgon image, in some form, existed in Greek visual culture well before Hesiod gave the story its earliest surviving literary shape, and that similar protective, frightening faces appear across a wide range of neighboring ancient cultures, suggesting that whatever specific origin the image had, it clearly answered some very deep, very widespread human need to visualize and externalize fear itself. Giving it a face specific enough to paint on a shield or carve above a doorway, and therefore, in a strange way, specific enough to feel at least partially controlled and managed, rather than simply endured. I find something quietly comforting in sitting with this kind of scholarly uncertainty, rather than rushing past it toward a tidier, more confident conclusion. So much of ancient history, especially history from the earliest periods before reliable written records, requires this kind of patient, humble not knowing, an acceptance that some questions simply cannot be answered with the confidence we might prefer, and that the honest work of history sometimes means sitting comfortably inside a genuine mystery, rather than forcing a false certainty onto it simply because uncertainty feels unsatisfying. Let's carry that same patient, unhurried spirit forward now, into one final quiet reflection before we bring tonight's story to its close, A chance to simply sit for a while longer with the distance between Medusa's world and our own, and with how much and how little has really changed in between. An ordinary evening. Then and now, I want to close our journey through Medusa's story with something quieter than mythology, something closer to plain human comparison, because I think it helps to actually feel the distance between her world and ours, rather than simply being told the dates and facts. Imagine, for a moment, an ordinary evening in a small Greek village, sometime around the 7th century BCE, roughly when Hesiod was composing the earliest surviving version of Medusa's genealogy. The sun has just gone down, and with it goes almost all reliable light. There is no flicking of a switch to banish the darkness instantly and completely. Instead, there is the careful, somewhat laborious process of maintaining oil lamps, small clay vessels filled with olive oil, a wick threaded through a spout, producing a small, warm, flickering light that barely reaches the corners of even a modest room, and which requires regular attention throughout the evening, oil to be refilled, wicks to be trimmed, the whole process demanding a kind of ongoing, quiet participation that we, with our instant electric light, rarely think about at all anymore. In that flickering lamplight, a family gathers, most likely in the single main room of a modest home, the smell of the evening meal, probably some combination of barley or wheat bread, olives, cheese, and perhaps a bit of fish or a simple vegetable stew, still lingering in the air. There is no television, obviously, no glowing screen of any kind pulling everyone's attention in a different direction. Entertainment, in the sense we think of it today, mostly meant conversation, storytelling, and perhaps music, if someone in the household happened to play a simple instrument like a lyre. It's within this exact setting, this quiet, dim, communal evening space, that a story like Medusa's would most naturally have been told and retold, passed from an older generation to a younger one, gaining small variations and embellishments with every retelling, exactly the kind of gradual, communal process that eventually produced the layered, complicated myth we've spent tonight exploring together. Now I want you to notice gently how different and yet how similar our own evening right now actually is. You're lying somewhere comfortable, the lights probably dimmed, listening to a voice tell you an old story about a woman transformed into something monstrous, about a hero's quest, about beauty, punishment, and eventual redemption of a sort. In some very real sense, you are doing exactly what that ancient Greek family was doing, participating in the same ancient, deeply human tradition of using a quiet evening and a calm voice to pass an old story from one mind to another, letting it settle in gently before sleep the way it likely settled into countless minds across countless centuries before yours. The differences, of course, are enormous. You're not worried about your oil lamp running dry. You're not sleeping on a straw-stuffed mattress on a dirt or simple stone floor, vulnerable to whatever weather might be happening outside a home with far less effective insulation than most modern buildings. You likely won't wake before dawn to grind grain by hand or walk to a well for the day's water. The physical texture of daily survival that shaped every single day of Medusa's imagined world, and every day of the real ancient people who first told her story, has changed almost beyond recognition in the roughly 27 centuries since Hesiod first wrote her genealogy down. And yet here we are, still telling her story, still finding something in it worth sitting with quietly at the end of a long day. Still finding, buried somewhere in that old tale of temples and curses and severed heads, a set of genuinely human questions that apparently never stop mattering to us, no matter how much daily life itself transforms around us. Questions about beauty and how it's perceived. Questions about fairness, and about what happens when the wrong person ends up paying the price for someone else's actions. Questions about how a person's reputation, once shaped by fear or admiration, can become almost impossible for that person to control or correct afterward, taking on a life entirely separate from their own actual experience. I think that's really the heart of why we're still telling this story, nearly 3,000 years after it first began circulating in a language that most people alive today couldn't read or speak. Not because the specific details of ancient Greek religion or mythology still hold the same weight they once did, but because underneath all that specific historical detail, there's something plainly, quietly human, something that a listener in an ancient village and a listener tonight, lying comfortably somewhere with the lights turned down low, can both recognize immediately, without needing any of it explained. The winking star in Perseus's hand. There's one more piece of this story I want to share with you before we close things out tonight. And I've saved it for last because I think it's the quietest and strangest detail in this entire myth. And it happens to connect directly to something you could, in principle, actually go outside and look at yourself on a clear night. When ancient Greek astronomers began mapping the night sky and assigning mythological figures to groups of stars, a practice that eventually gave us the constellations still used in astronomy today, they placed Perseus among the stars, along with Andromeda, her parents Cepheus and Cassiopeia, and even the sea monster Cetus, essentially recreating the entire rescue story we discussed earlier tonight as a permanent fixture of the night sky. Visible every year during the autumn and winter months in the northern hemisphere. Within the constellation Perseus, there is a particular star that the Greeks associated directly with Medusa's severed head, which Perseus, in the star chart, is depicted as still holding aloft. This star is known today by its Arabic-derived name, Algol, which comes from a phrase meaning something like the head of the ghoul or the demon's head, a name that Arab astronomers gave it centuries later, working from their own independent tradition of observing this particular point in the sky, apparently without necessarily knowing the Greek mythological association, and yet arriving, remarkably, at a strikingly similar sense that something unsettling was happening at that exact location. Here is the detail I want you to sit with slowly, because it's genuinely one of my favorite quiet facts in all of astronomy. Algol is what astronomers call a variable star, meaning its brightness doesn't stay constant the way most stars appear to from Earth. Every 2 days and 21 hours, roughly, Algol dims noticeably, dropping to about a third of its normal brightness for several hours before gradually returning to its usual intensity. Ancient observers, watching the night sky carefully over the course of many nights, the way people did in a world without artificial light pollution obscuring the stars, would have noticed this rhythmic dimming and brightening, this steady, blinking quality unlike almost any other star visible to the naked eye. We now understand exactly why this happens, thanks to modern astronomy. Algol is actually a system of at least two stars orbiting closely around each other, and periodically, from our particular vantage point here on Earth, the dimmer of the two stars passes directly in front of the brighter one, partially blocking its light in a predictable, recurring cycle. It's a purely mechanical, purely physical phenomenon, explainable through orbital mechanics and basic optics. Nothing supernatural about it at all, once you understand the underlying astrophysics. But imagine, for a moment, an ancient observer who had no access to that explanation, no telescopes, no understanding of binary star systems, simply watching a point of light in the night sky that inexplicably dimmed and brightened on a regular cycle, almost like a slow, deliberate blink. And imagine that this particular star happened to sit at precisely the spot in the sky's mythological map where Perseus was depicted holding Medusa's severed head. It's not difficult to understand why ancient and medieval skywatchers, working within an entirely different framework for explaining the world, might have looked at that slowly blinking star and felt, quite reasonably from within their own worldview, that they were looking at something genuinely uncanny. A demon's eye still winking from within a severed head, held aloft permanently among the stars, thousands of years after the myth itself was first told. I find something quietly moving in this final connection, the idea that this story, which began as an oral tradition passed between families gathered around lamplight in small Greek villages nearly 3,000 years ago, eventually found its way not just into pottery and temple carvings and Renaissance bronze, but into the literal architecture of how humans have organized and understood the night sky itself. Medusa's face, in some sense, is still up there, right now, visible on a clear autumn or winter evening if you know exactly where to look, slowly and steadily blinking on its own ancient, entirely explicable rhythm, indifferent to the fact that the story explaining its presence there is, by any reasonable measure, no longer believed as literal truth by anyone looking up at it. It feels like a fitting note to end on, tonight of all nights, since you're likely lying somewhere quiet yourself right now, perhaps with a window nearby, perhaps not, but either way settling gently towards sleep the same way people have settled towards sleep for thousands of years. Sometimes with an old story like this one still turning over quietly in the back of their mind, blinking softly, the way Algol blinks somewhere out there in the actual sky above you, whether or not you can see it tonight. What became of the sisters before we close out tonight's story entirely? I want to return briefly to two figures we mentioned early on and haven't spoken of since. Athena and Uriel, Medusa's immortal sisters. It's easy to let them fade into the background of this story, since the myths themselves give them relatively little individual attention compared to Medusa. But I think a few quiet minutes with their fate rounds out tonight's story in a way that feels worth taking. Because Athena and Uriel were immortal, they could not be killed the way Medusa was, and the ancient sources largely lose interest in them once Perseus completes his escape from their lair. They are mentioned waking in fury, searching for the intruder who killed their sister, and then, in most versions of the myth, they simply disappear from the narrative entirely, presumably continuing to exist somewhere at the edges of the world, immortal and unchanging, for the rest of time, however long that might actually mean for beings who exist entirely outside the framework of ordinary mortal lifespan. I want you to imagine gently what that continued existence might have actually felt like for them, though of course the myths never bother to explore this themselves. Two sisters, suddenly reduced from three, waking every morning, if morning even meant the same thing to beings like them, to an emptiness where a third presence had always been. Immortality, in so many strands of Greek mythology, is quietly haunted by exactly this kind of long, unresolved grief. Gods and immortal beings forced to watch mortal companions, lovers and family members age, suffer and die, while they themselves remain fixed and unchanging, carrying memories across a span of time that mortal minds were never designed to hold onto so completely. Later Greek and Roman writers occasionally mention the Gorgons collectively, even after Medusa's death, sometimes using the term loosely to refer to Athena and Uriel alone, other times using it almost as a generic label for monstrous or frightening figures more broadly, suggesting that popular memory of the two immortal sisters gradually blurred, over centuries of retelling, into something closer to a general category than two individually remembered characters. In this way, their story mirrors something we've touched on a few times tonight: the way myths tend to sharpen certain details through repetition, while letting others soften and blur, depending on which parts of a story each new generation of storytellers found most worth preserving, and which parts simply stopped serving whatever purpose the story needed to serve. I think there's something quietly worth sitting with in the fact that Athena and Uriel, whatever their own fates ultimately were, continued existing somewhere in that liminal, edge-of-the-world space long after their sister's story had ended, long after Perseus had returned home, married, founded his city, and eventually died himself, long after the entire human cast of this story had lived out their lives and passed away. Immortal beings in Greek mythology often carry this particular quality of persistence, continuing on quietly in the margins of stories that have otherwise long since concluded for everyone else involved. A reminder that even within a mythology as full of dramatic endings as this one, some things were simply imagined to continue, unresolved and ongoing, indefinitely. The fame of a single detail before we move into our closing thoughts tonight. I want to linger a little longer on one small detail we passed over fairly quickly earlier, because I think it deserves a slower look. Remember that Ovid tells us Medusa was famous specifically for her hair, not her face as a whole, not her figure but her hair in particular. A detail so specific that it's worth actually imagining what hair care and hair culture looked like in the ancient Greek world, so that we can understand just how remarkable this particular kind of fame would have actually been. In ancient Greece, hair carried enormous social and symbolic weight, for women especially. Long, healthy, carefully maintained hair was considered one of the clearest outward signs of both beauty and respectability, and Greek women invested considerable time and effort into its care, using olive oil to keep it soft and glossy, in the absence of anything resembling modern shampoo or conditioner. Imagine a young woman, perhaps Medusa herself in the years before her transformation, sitting in the relatively private, domestic space of a home's inner rooms, working olive oil slowly through long sections of hair with her fingers, a task that could take a considerable portion of an afternoon, especially if the hair was particularly long or thick, and especially if she had the help of a mother, sister, or household servant to assist with sections she couldn't easily reach or see herself. Greek women of this era commonly wore their hair long, often styled into elaborate arrangements for special occasions, festivals, and religious ceremonies, using simple pins, ribbons, and fabric wraps rather than the metal accessories that became more common in later periods. For an ordinary day, hair might simply be tied back or covered with a light cloth to keep it out of the way during household work. But for temple service specifically, given the respectable, sacred nature of the role, a young woman like Medusa would likely have taken particular care with her appearance, understanding that she represented not just herself, but the dignity of the goddess she served. I want you to imagine, for a moment, the specific reputation such beauty would have generated in a small ancient community, the kind of reputation that spreads not through anything resembling modern media, but through the much slower, much more intimate channel of ordinary conversation, one person mentioning it to another at a well or a market stall, a traveler remarking on it after passing through town, the story gradually spreading outward in ever-widening circles until, as Ovid tells us, suitors began traveling considerable distances, specifically hoping for the chance to see this celebrated hair for themselves. There would have been no photographs, no paintings even in most cases, to confirm or exaggerate the claims beyond what word of mouth alone could carry, meaning Medusa's reputation existed almost entirely in the realm of description and imagination, growing perhaps even more remarkable with each new person who repeated what they had heard rather than what they had personally witnessed. This detail matters for understanding the specific cruelty embedded in her later transformation. Athena did not simply give Medusa an ugly or frightening face in some generic sense. She took the single physical feature Medusa was most celebrated for, the feature that had brought her the most attention, the most admiration, and quite possibly the most unwanted romantic pursuit as well, and transformed that exact feature into the source of her curse and her isolation. The very thing that once drew people toward her, hoping for a glimpse of her beauty, became the thing that would keep every living creature away from her for the rest of her life, unable to approach without risking their own death. There is a particular, almost surgical precision to this punishment that I think is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. The way it takes exactly what was once a source of pride and admiration and turns it, without changing its essential physical location or form, into a permanent, isolating danger. It's worth remembering, too, that hair in ancient Mediterranean symbolic thought was very often connected to notions of vitality, sexuality, and personal identity more broadly, a connection that shows up across numerous ancient cultures in different forms, from Samson's strength residing in his uncut hair in the Hebrew Bible, to various Greek rituals involving the cutting and dedication of hair as an offering at moments of significant life transition, such as marriage or coming of age. Against that broader cultural backdrop, The transformation of Medusa's hair specifically into serpents would have carried a particular symbolic weight for ancient audiences that might be easy for modern listeners to miss. A corruption not just of appearance, but of something closer to her fundamental vitality and identity, twisted into something that could no longer be touched, admired, or approached in any of the ordinary ways a woman's beauty once was. We'll let that thought settle now, quietly, as we move into our final closing moments together tonight. A goddess worth sitting with. There's one more figure in this story I think deserves a slower, gentler look before we close things out, and that's Athena herself. Because I don't want tonight's story to leave you thinking of her simply as a villain in this particular tale. Even though her role in Medusa's transformation is genuinely difficult to sit with comfortably. Ancient religion rarely divided its gods into simple categories of good and evil, the way later religious traditions often would. And Athena's own mythology is full of contradictions worth understanding a little better. Athena was, across the wider body of Greek mythology, one of the more consistently respected and admired deities, associated with wisdom, strategic warfare as opposed to chaotic bloodlust, weaving and household crafts, and the protection of cities, most famously Athens itself, which bore her name and treated her as its primary patron and protector. She was also notably a virgin goddess, one of three in the Greek pantheon alongside Artemis and Hestia, a status that carried particular weight within Greek religious thought, tied closely to ideas of independence, self-possession, and a kind of inviolable personal boundary that Athena herself was understood to guard fiercely, for herself, and by extension, for the sacred spaces under her protection. Imagine, for a moment, approaching this story from within Athena's own mythological logic, rather than our own modern framework for thinking about fairness and blame. A temple was not simply a building in ancient Greek religious thought. It was understood as an extension of the deity's own presence and person, a sacred boundary that mortals and even other gods were expected to respect absolutely. When that boundary was violated, ancient religious logic often treated the violation itself as the central offense requiring response, sometimes almost independent of the specific human circumstances or intentions involved. This doesn't make the outcome for Medusa any less painful to sit with, but it does help explain why an ancient audience might have understood Athena's fury as directed primarily at the desecration of her sacred space, rather than specifically and narrowly at Medusa as an individual deserving of personal punishment, even though the actual, lived consequence for Medusa herself was, of course, exactly the same either way. I think it's worth holding both of these perspectives gently at once. The ancient religious logic that framed Athena's response as a matter of sacred boundaries rather than personal cruelty, and the modern, deeply human recognition that, whatever the underlying religious reasoning, an innocent woman still bore the entire weight of a punishment that by any reasonable modern standard should have fallen elsewhere. Neither perspective cancels the other out entirely. Understanding why ancient audiences may have found Athena's actions less troubling than we do today doesn't require us to abandon our own, more modern sense that something genuinely unjust occurred in this story. It simply helps us understand the story more fully, on its own terms as well as ours, which I think is really the entire point of spending an evening like this one, walking slowly through a myth this old and this well-worn. It's also worth remembering that Athena's involvement in this story doesn't end with the curse itself. She remains present throughout Perseus's entire quest, guiding him toward the Gree, helping him identify which sleeping sister was mortal, and ultimately receiving Medusa's severed head as a permanent addition to her own protective equipment. There's a reading of this continued involvement that suggests something more complicated than simple, settled anger, perhaps something closer to an ongoing, unresolved relationship between the goddess and the woman she had once transformed, one that finally concludes not with further punishment, but with Medusa's face becoming a permanent part of Athena's own protective power, guarding the goddess herself for the rest of eternity. Whether that ending should be read as a kind of strange honor, finally elevating Medusa into permanent divine protection, or as one final, uncomfortable use of a woman's suffering for someone else's benefit, is a question the ancient sources leave entirely open. And I think it's a question worth sitting with quietly rather than rushing to answer definitively, one way or the other, tonight. We've traveled a long way together tonight, and I want to take a few final, quiet minutes to gather everything up, gently, before we let this story settle and let you drift the rest of the way towards sleep. We began at the very bottom of the Greek mythological world, with Phorcys and Ceeta, ancient sea deities older than the familiar gods of Olympus, and their strange, remarkable children, the Gree with their single shared eye, and the three Gorgon sisters, Athena, Uriel, and Medusa, the only mortal one among them. We talked about how the earliest Greek image of a Gorgon wasn't tragic or beautiful at all, but a wide, grinning, tongue-lolling mask, meant simply to frighten evil away from doorways, shields, and sacred spaces, a purely protective symbol rather than a portrait of any individual woman. Then we followed the story as it slowly changed over the centuries, arriving eventually at Ovid's far more sympathetic version, written centuries later in Rome, in which Medusa began as a mortal woman famous for the singular beauty of her hair, serving faithfully in the temple of Athena, until Poseidon's assault against her, and Athena's furious response directed not at the god responsible but at Medusa herself, transformed her into the monster history would remember. We sat for a while in the quiet, uncomfortable years that likely followed, imagining her exile at the edge of the known world, alongside her immortal sisters, carrying within that imagined isolation the unborn children of the very violation that had led to her transformation in the first place. We then turned to Perseus, following his story from before he was even born, through the prophecy that frightened his grandfather Acrisius into sealing Danae and her infant son inside a wooden chest and setting them adrift on the sea, through his childhood on Seriphos in the household of the kind fisherman Dictys, and into the cruel trick that King Polydex used to send him on what was meant to be an impossible, fatal quest. We watched Perseus gather the tools he would need, tricking the Gree out of their information, receiving winged sandals, a magical bag, and the helm of invisibility from the nymphs, a curved sword from Hermes, and a polished, mirror-like shield from Athena herself, the same goddess who had cursed Medusa to begin with. We followed him on his long flight to the edge of the world, past frozen figures scattered like a silent warning across the ground near the Gorgon's lair, and we sat with the beheading itself, slow and deliberate, Perseus guiding his blade by reflection alone, never once looking directly at the woman he was about to kill in her sleep. We witnessed the strange, simultaneous birth and death that followed, Pegasus and Chrysaor springing forth from Medusa's severed neck, in the very same instant her long life finally ended. From there, we followed Perseus onward, past the Titan Atlas, transformed into the mountain range that still bears his name today, to the rocky cliff where Andromeda waited in chains, and through the rescue that gave Medusa's severed head its first genuinely protective use, saving an innocent life rather than merely claiming one. We returned with him to Seriphos, where the head was used one final time, turning Polydex and his court to stone in an act that closed the loop of cruelty that had started the entire quest. And we followed the prophecy to its strange, accidental fulfillment years later, when a misthrown discus finally brought Acrisius's long-feared death to pass, exactly as the oracle had predicted so many years before. In exactly the roundabout way prophecies in Greek mythology always seem to insist on fulfilling themselves. And then we widened our view considerably, following Medusa's face forward across nearly 3,000 years of human history, from archaic Greek shields and temple pediments, through Roman household mosaics and signet rings, into Renaissance Florence where Cellini cast her death in bronze and Caravaggio painted her final, terrified breath onto a ceremonial shield, through Bernini's careful studies of her gradual transformation, and finally into our own contemporary moment, where her face still appears on fashion labels recognized around the world, and where a bronze statue in Lower Manhattan now shows her standing triumphant instead, holding the head of the very hero who once claimed her own. We even looked briefly at the night sky itself, at the slowly blinking star called Algol, held forever in the depicted hand of the constellation Perseus, a small, quiet, scientifically explicable astronomical phenomenon that ancient and medieval observers nonetheless read as a demon's watchful, winking eye, still present somewhere above us on any clear night, whether we think to look for it or not. What I hope stays with you after tonight, more than any single detail from this long journey, is the sense of just how much a single story can hold within it, how something that begins as a simple genealogical note in an ancient poem can grow, over centuries of retelling, into a genuinely complicated meditation on beauty, violation, injustice, protection, and the strange, persistent power of an image to outlive every single person who first told the story it represents. Medusa was never really just a monster, and she was never really just a victim either, not in any way the ancient sources allow us to settle into simply and finally. She was, and in a strange way still is, whatever each generation of listeners has needed her to be, a warning, a guardian, a tragedy, a symbol of dangerous beauty and a slowly blinking star, all held together inside the same old story, still being told tonight, quietly in the dark, the same way it has been told for nearly 3,000 years. I want to thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I know these stories run long, and I know that's exactly the point. A slow, unhurried journey meant to carry you gently towards sleep while leaving behind something real and true to think about whenever you happen to wake. If you found yourself drifting off partway through, that's exactly as it should be, and I hope whatever dreams follow are calm ones. If tonight's story kept you good company, I'd really appreciate it if you considered subscribing, so you don't miss the next quiet journey through history we take together. There's a whole world of these stories waiting, calm evenings spent with Vikings and pharaohs, with lost cities and forgotten empires, all told the same unhurried way, without noise, without rush, just a voice in the dark and an old story worth taking slowly. If tonight helped you relax or helped you fall asleep, consider leaving that in a comment before you go. It genuinely helps this quiet little corner of the internet keep finding the people who need it. I think about how many places this story has already reached over just the time I've been sitting here telling it to you tonight. Someone listening in a quiet apartment in the American Midwest, the heater humming faintly somewhere down the hall. Someone else halfway across the country on the West Coast, where it might still be early evening, the last light just now fading outside the window. Maybe someone listening from a truck stop parking lot on a long overnight drive, headlights of passing traffic sweeping occasionally across the ceiling. Maybe someone in the UK or Australia catching this well past midnight their time, unable to sleep for reasons that have nothing to do with ancient Greece at all, just looking for a calm voice to keep them company until their mind finally lets go. Wherever you happen to be tonight, and whatever time your own clock happens to read right now, I like to imagine all of you out there in the dark together, in your own separate rooms, sharing this same old story at slightly different moments. The way people once shared it around actual fires, actual lamps, actual hearths, long before any of this technology existed to carry a voice this far. There's something quietly remarkable in that image, if you let yourself sit with it for a moment instead of drifting past it. A story about a woman who lived, according to the myth, at the very edge of the known world, in a place so remote that ancient sailors genuinely feared approaching it, has now traveled farther than any of those ancient storytellers could possibly have imagined, reaching living rooms and bedrooms and cars and truck cabs scattered across an entire globe those first storytellers never even knew existed. Medusa's story outlived the civilization that created it by well over 2,000 years, outlived the language it was first told in, outlived every single person who ever believed, even for a moment, that she was real. And here it is, still finding new listeners, still doing the quiet work old stories have always done, filling the dark, comfortable hours before sleep with something to think about besides the ordinary worries of an ordinary day. I hope, wherever you are, that your own evening winds down gently from here. I hope the rest of your night holds nothing more dramatic than the story we've just walked through together, and that whatever comes next for you tonight is simple, quiet, and undemanding. If your eyes are already heavy, let them close. If your mind is already drifting, let it drift. There's nothing more you need to do right now except rest. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whatever time it happens to be where you are, I hope you're warm, I hope you're comfortable, and I hope the rest of your night is peaceful. Thank you for spending these hours with me. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time for another quiet story from the boring, beautiful past.